Hello everyone, and welcome back to Haunting Words. If you found this video, you're probably looking for something to fall asleep, and I'm here to deliver. But before starting, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, let me know where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I never believed in ghosts, at least not in the way movies or books describe them. Shadows moving on their own, objects flying across the room, doors slamming shut by themselves. No, that was just fiction. I was the kind of person who needed hard proof before believing anything supernatural. But sometimes, proof comes in ways you never expect. This story takes place a few years ago, back when I moved into an old rental house on the outskirts of town. It wasn't anything fancy, just a small 2-bedroom home that had probably seen better days. The rent was cheap, which was all that mattered to me at the time. I had just gotten a job at a publishing company, and between student loans and bills, I couldn't afford to be picky. The house sat on a quiet street, surrounded by trees that loomed over the sidewalk like silent watchers. The neighbors were polite, but kept to themselves. It was the kind of place where people mowed their lawns on Sundays, but never really talked to each other beyond a quick nod. The landlord, an older man with gray hair and a permanent scowl, handed me the keys with a warning. Pipes act up sometimes. Just give it a minute if the water pressure's weird. At the time, I thought nothing of it. My first few weeks in the house were uneventful. I spent most of my time at work, coming home late and eating dinner in front of the TV. The place had an odd smell, like damp wood and something faintly metallic, but I figured it was just an old house being an old house. I wasn't alone in the house though. My friend, who had also just started a new job in the city, moved in with me to split the rent. He was an easygoing guy, not the type to get spooked over creaky floors or weird noises. At night, the house made its usual sounds. The walls groaned as they settled. The wind pressed against the windows, making them rattle slightly in their frames. The plumbing gurgled every now and then, but I chalked it up to old pipes. For the first month, that was all it was, just an aging house making aging house noises. Then, things changed. It started with the faucet. It was always the kitchen sink. No matter how many times I checked, it'd wake up to find a slow trickle of water running from the tap. At first, I blamed my friend. Maybe he had forgotten to turn it off completely. Maybe the old pipes were just loose. But when I asked him about it, he swore he never touched the sink at night. I tried to let it go. After all, it wasn't like the faucet was turning on full blast. It was just a few drops. Nothing to lose sleep over. Then, the dripping got louder. One night, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, when I heard it. Drip, drip, drip. It was steady, almost rhythmic, like a slow heartbeat. I sighed, got up, and made my way to the kitchen. The sink was on again, just a thin stream of water slipping down the drain. I turned the knob tightly, making sure it was completely off. By the time I got back to my room, I heard it again. Drip, drip. A slow chill spread across my skin. I didn't go back to check. Instead, I pulled the covers over my head and forced myself to sleep. The next morning, my friend and I had a long conversation. I told him what had been happening, half expecting him to admit he had been messing with me. But the look on his face told me otherwise. I hear it too, he said. But it's not just the sink. I frowned. What do you mean? He hesitated, then rubbed the back of his neck. Sometimes I hear it in the bathroom, the sound of water running. But when I go check, the sink is dry. I laughed nervously, trying to brush it off. Old pipes, right? But he didn't laugh. We both knew something was wrong with that house. We just didn't know how bad it was going to get. The dripping continued. At first, it was just an annoyance, something I tried to ignore. Every night, without fail, the faucet in the kitchen would turn on just enough for a thin stream of water to run down the drain. I would get up, turn it off, double check it, and go back to bed. But no matter how tightly I twisted the knob, it'd still wake up to that same sound. My friend, let's call him D, wasn't any more thrilled about it than I was. One night, after I had gone through the usual routine of shutting off the kitchen faucet, I heard him call out from his room, "Did you just use the bathroom sink?" I was already half asleep and groggy. "No, why?" There was a pause. Then, "I swear I just heard water running in there." I sat up, suddenly more awake. This wasn't funny anymore. I grabbed my phone for some light and stepped into the hallway. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the sink. I flipped the light switch. The sink was dry. I turned to D, who was now standing behind me, arms crossed. His face was tense. "You heard it too, right?" he asked. I nodded. We both stood there for a long moment, just staring at the sink as if expecting it to turn on right in front of us. It didn't. We checked the pipes under the sink, the water heater, even the basement to see if there was some kind of pressure issue, but everything looked fine. The landlord's words echoed in my head. Pipes act up sometimes, but this wasn't just the plumbing. Still, we tried to convince ourselves that's all it was. We had busy jobs. Neither of us had the time or patience to obsess over weird house noises. So, we let it go. At least, we tried to. The first real scare came about a week later. It was around 2 a.m., and I was still awake, reading on my phone in bed. D had gone to sleep earlier, so the house was silent except for the occasional creak of the wooden floor settling. I was just about to put my phone down when I heard it. Drip, drip, drip. This time, it wasn't coming from the kitchen. It was the bathroom. The door to my room was open just enough for me to see the hallway, and as I lay there, completely still, I realized something was off. The sound wasn't just a drip. It was running water, like a faucet had been turned on full blast. I sat up, my heartbeat picking up speed. I listened, hoping it would stop on its own. But the longer I waited, the more certain I became that I wasn't imagining it. I reached for my phone, turned on the flashlight, and stepped into the hallway. The bathroom door was wide open. The sink was running. I could hear the water splashing against porcelain, and when I took a step forward, my foot hit something cold. Water. A thin puddle had formed on the bathroom floor, creeping towards the hallway. My stomach twisted. D's door was closed. I knew he hadn't gotten up. For a long moment, I just stood there, staring at the running water. I wanted to call out to him, but something in me refused to make a sound. I reached out, turned the faucet off, and backed away. Then, just as I was about to turn, I heard it. A noise so quiet, so faint, I almost missed it. A breath. Right behind me. I spun around, phone light shaking in my hand. No one was there. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, D came out of his room looking just as exhausted as I felt. "You heard it too, didn't you?" I asked. He nodded, rubbing his eyes. I heard water running again, but when I checked, it was already off. I swallowed hard. It wasn't off when I found it. His expression darkened. We sat down at the kitchen table, neither of us touching our coffee. For the first time, we admitted what we had both been avoiding. "This place is weird," D said. That was putting it lightly. We spent the next few hours trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe the pipes were malfunctioning. Maybe there was some kind of automatic pressure release we didn't know about. Maybe one of us had sleepwalked and turned the faucet on without realizing it. That last one didn't make sense though. Neither of us had ever sleepwalked before, and it wasn't just the water that bothered us. It was the feeling, like something was in the house with us, watching, listening, waiting. It got worse from there. The dripping became more frequent. Every night, no matter how tightly we shut the faucets, they would start again. Then, it wasn't just the faucets. It was the shower. The first time I heard it, I was sitting in the living room, watching TV. Dee was out, and I was finally enjoying some quiet time. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the unmistakable sound of water hitting the bathtub. Not dripping. Running. Full blast. My body went cold. I stood up slowly, heart pounding against my ribs. The bathroom door was closed, but steam was slipping out from the crack at the bottom. I hadn't used the shower. I hadn't even been near the bathroom. I reached for the doorknob, hesitated, then pushed the door open. The shower was on. Hot water poured from the faucet, fogging up the mirror. The air was thick with heat, making it hard to breathe. And then, a shadow. Just for a second. In the fogged up mirror behind me. I spun around. Nothing. The room was empty. I turned off the water with shaking hands and backed out of the room. I didn't tell Dee about that one. Not yet. Because for the first time since moving in, I felt something I hadn't felt before. I wasn't just scared. I was being watched. And whoever or whatever was watching didn't want me there. The house was no longer just weird. It was wrong. At first, the faucets turning on had been disturbing, but manageable. I could shake it off, blame it on the plumbing, pretend it wasn't happening. But that was no longer an option. The water wasn't just dripping or running. It was turning on at full blast, at random times of the night. The sound of rushing water would wake me up, and every time I got out of bed to check, I would find the sink or the shower on, scalding hot steam filling the room. It was always hot, never cold. And there was something else. The presence. It was stronger now. I wasn't sure how to explain it. It wasn't something I could see, not clearly, but I could feel it. Have you ever had that sensation that someone is standing behind you? That static-like tension on the back of your neck, the heavy awareness that you aren't alone? That feeling followed me everywhere. It didn't matter if I was in the kitchen, the living room, or my own bedroom. The air in the house felt charged, thick. The hairs on my arms were always standing up. And the worst part? It wasn't just at night anymore. Dee was the first one to bring it up. One evening, we were sitting in the living room, eating in silence. The TV was on, but neither of us were paying attention. After a while, Dee put his fork down and exhaled sharply. I don't like this place, man. I looked up. What do you mean? I asked, even though I already knew. He shook his head. I don't know. Something feels off. I swear I keep seeing things, just in the corner of my eye. I felt my stomach twist. Like what? I asked carefully. He hesitated. Just, I don't know. Shapes, shadows. He'll be doing something normal, brushing my teeth, working at my desk, whatever, and for a split second, he'll see something move in the mirror. But when I look, there's nothing there. I didn't say anything, because I had seen them too. The first time, I convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I had been walking past the bathroom, and in the reflection of the mirror, I swore I saw a figure standing in the hallway. But when I turned around, the hallway was empty. The second time, I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone. The screen dimmed for a second, and in the black reflection, I saw something standing in my doorway. I had jumped up, heart pounding. But when I looked, the doorway was empty. Dee ran a hand down his face and sighed. And the water, he muttered. Man, it's getting worse. I nodded slowly. It's not just the water anymore. He lifted his head. What do you mean? I swallowed. Something's here, I admitted. I don't know what, but we aren't alone in this house. We decided to do something about it. After dinner, we both went to the bathroom together, determined to see if there was anything physically wrong with the plumbing. We started with the sink. He turned the knobs on and off a few times, testing the pressure. The water flowed normally, nothing strange. He got down on the floor, checking the pipes underneath. Everything was fine. We moved to the bathtub next. The shower head looked normal, and the knobs felt tight when I turned them. No leaks, No dripping. Nothing. He stood up, stretching his arms. "Well, so much for that," he muttered. We stood there for a moment, neither of us sure what to do next. Then, on impulse, I turned towards the mirror. There was nothing behind us, just our reflections. But the longer I stared, the more I felt like something was watching back. A thought crossed my mind. What if we left the faucet on? Just to see? I hesitated. "Let's leave the water running," I said. He frowned. "Why?" I shrugged, but the real reason was simple. I wanted to catch whatever was happening. Maybe it was stupid, but I had to know. He turned the faucet back on. The water poured down the drain, splashing loudly against the porcelain. We left the light on and stepped out, leaving the door slightly ajar so we could still hear it. And then we waited. 5 minutes. 10. 15. Nothing happened. Just as Dee was about to say something, we heard it. A soft creak. The bathroom door. Slowly, the door was swinging shut on its own. The air in the hallway grew heavy, thick like the pressure was dropping. I could feel my heartbeat in my ears. Dee and I exchanged a look, neither of us moving. Then, click. The door shut. The faucet turned off. Silence. The house felt wrong. Dee swallowed hard. "Did you see that?" I nodded. My hands were cold. We stood there for a moment, neither of us moving. Then I took a step forward. My entire body screamed at me not to, but I reached out and turned the doorknob. It wouldn't budge. The door was locked. From the inside. Dee let out a shaky breath. No way. We weren't imagining this. Something was in there, and it had locked us out. The door stayed locked for nearly an hour. We tried everything, turning the knob, pushing against it, even using a screwdriver to pick the lock. But it was useless. Then, as suddenly as it had locked, click, the door swung open on its own. The bathroom was empty. The air inside was heavy with steam, as if someone had just taken a scalding shower. The mirror was fogged up, and on the glass, written in streaks of condensation, were 3 long, dripping lines, like fingertips had dragged down the surface. Tiki took a step back. I stared at the mirror, my breath caught in my throat. We weren't just dealing with weird plumbing. We weren't just imagining things. Something was here. And now it knew we were paying attention. After that night, the activity escalated fast. The dripping water became a constant. No matter how many times we turned off the faucets, they would start again. Sometimes just a slow, steady drip, other times full force, gushing like something was deliberately turning the knobs. And the shadows? They weren't just in the mirrors anymore. One night, as I was heading to my room, I saw it. Not a glimpse, not a flicker, a shape, standing at the end of the hallway, tall, motionless, watching. My throat went dry. My fingers clenched around my phone, but I didn't dare move. I could feel its eyes on me, even though I couldn't see its face. Then it took a step forward. The light flickered, and just like that, it was gone. We tried to ignore it, tried to pretend it wasn't happening, but the house had other plans. Every night, the faucets ran. Every night, the shadows got closer. And every night, that awful, suffocating feeling grew stronger. Like we were being watched. Like we weren't supposed to be here. And then, the knocking started. The knocking started around 3 a.m. At first, it was soft. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap against the walls. I was half asleep, barely registering the sound. But then it got louder. It wasn't coming from the front door. It wasn't coming from the windows. It was coming from inside the house. I sat up, every muscle in my body tensing. Across the room, my phone screen glowed dimly. 3:12 a.m. The knocking came again, closer this time. My breath hitched. It sounded like it was coming from the hallway. Then, Doug's voice. Hey, are you awake? He sounded off. His voice was flat, too even, like he was trying too hard to sound normal. I swallowed hard. Yeah. A long pause. Then, open your door. A chill ran down my spine. Something was wrong. My door was already open. I didn't move. I barely even breathed. The air in my room was thick, pressing against my chest. I knew something was standing just outside my doorway. And it wasn't D. I reached for my phone, my fingers trembling. I typed out a message. Me, are you in the hallway? I hit send. Seconds passed. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. Then my phone buzzed. D, no, I'm in my room. Why? My stomach dropped. The knocking returned. Louder. Faster. This time, it wasn't against the walls. It was against my doorframe. I squeezed my eyes shut, my entire body frozen. And then, the faucet turned on. The sudden rush of water from my bathroom sink filled the room. The light in my bathroom flickered, casting erratic shadows across the walls. My breathing came in short gasps. My chest was tight, my limbs stiff. The knocking stopped, but the presence was still there, watching, waiting. I forced myself to move. Slowly, I reached for the lamp on my nightstand. My fingers brushed against the switch. The second I turned it on, the knocking started again. Harder, faster, more frantic. Like something was pounding against the wood, desperate to get in. My body moved before I could think. I grabbed my phone, jumped out of bed, and bolted for the door. The second I stepped into the hallway, the lights flickered violently. The bathroom faucet was still running. Steam poured out of the open door, thick and suffocating. The mirror was completely fogged over. Dee's door burst open. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, his face pale and his eyes wide. What the hell is going on? I couldn't answer, because at that moment, something moved inside the bathroom. A shadow. Tall. Wrong. It didn't walk. It glided. Through the steam, through the flickering light, it turned toward us. And the knocking. It came from inside the walls now. Fast. Hard. Surrounding us. T grabbed my arm. Run! We bolted down the hall. The air was thick, pressing against our skin like invisible hands. The knocking followed us, inside the walls, inside the ceiling, beneath the floorboards. We reached the living room, but the second we did, every single faucet turned on. The kitchen sink, the bathroom, the tub, the shower. Water gushed from every fixture in the house, pouring onto the floors, dripping from the ceilings. I skidded to a stop, my socks slipping on the wet floor. Dee grabbed my arm to steady me, his breathing ragged. What the hell is happening? I couldn't answer, because in that moment, the lights went out, and the knocking stopped. For just 1 second. Then, the whispering started. Low, unintelligible, but close, right next to my ear. Something cold brushed against my neck. And then, the lights exploded back on. And I saw it, standing in the middle of the room. Not a shadow this time. Something real, something wrong. Its limbs were too long. Its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. Its skin was pale and stretched too tight over its bones. And its eyes, hollow, black, endless, staring right at me. He screamed. The thing moved, fast, straight toward us. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a chair, and threw it at the figure. The moment it made contact, the lights flickered violently, and the entire house shook. The faucet stopped. The whispering stopped, and the figure vanished. We stood there, gasping for breath. Water dripped from the counters, the sinks, the walls. The house was dead silent. I turned to Dee, my chest heaving. We have to get out of here. She didn't argue. He sprinted to his room, grabbing his keys and his wallet. I did the same. Neither of us spoke. Neither of us looked back. We ran out the door into the freezing night air. The second we stepped off the porch, the house lights flickered one last time. And then the front door slammed shut on its own, hard enough to shake the windows, like something inside was angry, like it knew we were leaving, and it wasn't happy about it. Dee's hands were shaking so badly he fumbled with the car keys. "Just open it," I hissed, glancing over my shoulder at the house. The porch light flickered again, casting erratic shadows against the front door. Finally, the locks clicked, and we scrambled into the car. He started the engine with a shaky breath. As soon as he put it in reverse, the porch light went out. The house was completely dark. For a second, neither of us moved. The only sound was the roar of the engine and our heavy breathing. Then, the knocking came again. But this time, it wasn't inside the house. It was coming from outside the car. My breath hitched. The sound was soft, deliberate. A slow tap, tap, tap against the back window. I turned my head, stomach twisting. The window was fogged up from the cold. But there, just barely visible, a handprint. I didn't even have time to react before Dee slammed his foot on the gas. The tires screeched against the pavement, and we tore out of the driveway, speeding down the empty road. Neither of us spoke. The farther we got from the house, the more the tension in my chest eased. But the weight of what had just happened stayed, pressing down on my lungs like a vice. Only when we reached a gas station a few miles away did Dee finally pull over. He turned to me, face pale, hands gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles were white. "What the hell was that?" I shook my head. I had no answer. All I knew was that we were never going back. We sat in that car for what felt like hours. The gas station's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting everything in an artificial glow. It felt safer here, far away from the house. But my mind wouldn't stop racing. The knocking, the faucets, the thing in the living room. It wasn't just a trick of the light. It wasn't our imagination. Something had been inside that house with us, and it knew we saw it. It broke the silence. "We have to go back for our stuff." I whipped my head toward him. "Are you insane?" He ran a hand down his face. "We left everything, man. My laptop, my work stuff, my clothes." "Forget it." I shook my head. "I'm never stepping foot in that house again." Dee exhaled sharply and leaned back against the seat. He looked just as exhausted as I felt. Deep down, he knew I was right. The next morning, we called the landlord. Neither of us wanted to explain what really happened, so we lied. Said there was an issue with the plumbing, weird electrical problems, and that we didn't feel safe staying there. He sounded annoyed, but agreed to let us break the lease. We hired movers to collect our things while we stayed far away. When they finished, one of the workers called us. "You guys sure you want to leave this place?" he asked. "Yeah," I said immediately. "Why?" There was a long pause. "No reason," he muttered. "Just feels weird in here, like someone's still living in it." A week later, I looked up the house history. I don't know why. Maybe I just needed closure. Maybe I wanted some kind of explanation. But what I found only made it worse. Years ago, before we moved in, a man had died in that house. Alone. He was found slumped over the bathroom sink, the faucet still running. No one knew how long he had been there before they found him. And the worst part? Neighbors reported hearing knocking in the walls for weeks before his body was discovered. Dee and I never talked about what happened after that. We moved to different apartments in different parts of the city. But sometimes, late at night, I swear I still hear it. Soft. Deliberate. A slow, steady tap, tap, tap against the walls. Like something is still trying to get in. Or worse, like it never really left. Some things, no matter how much time passes, never really leave you. It's been years since we left that house, but I still find myself thinking about it. About the knocking, the faucets, the way the air felt thick with something unseen, something watching. I don't talk to D much anymore. We drifted apart after we moved out, and I don't blame him. Sometimes shared trauma does that to people. It links you together in ways no one else would understand, but it also makes it hard to be around each other. Every conversation felt like we were walking through that house again, reliving the fear, the confusion, the presence that we both knew was real. So we went our separate ways. But I still feel it. Not all the time, not every day, but on certain nights when the world is quiet and the only sound is the hum of the city outside my window, I hear it. A soft, rhythmic tap, tap, tap. It never comes from the same place twice. Sometimes it's the window. Sometimes it's the walls. Once it was the bathroom mirror. I never check. I tell myself it's just the building settling, just some old pipes, just something logical. But my hands still clench the blankets a little tighter when it happens. My breath still hitches. My heart still pounds. Because deep down, I know that house may be miles away, but whatever was inside it, it followed me. I don't tell people this story anymore. Most wouldn't believe it, and the ones who do, they don't know what to say. Some suggest cleansing rituals. Others tell me to see a priest. A few say I should go back, confront whatever it is, but I shut that down immediately. Going back isn't an option. Some doors, once closed, should stay closed. A few weeks ago, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something told me I should. When I answered, no one spoke at first, just silence. Then, faint, distant, a dripping sound, slow, steady, like a faucet left running. I hung up immediately, blocked the number, turned on every light in my apartment. I checked the sinks, the bathtub, even the pipes under the kitchen. Everything was dry. But that night, as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I swore I could hear it again. Somewhere, just out of reach. A slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap. There are things in this world we weren't meant to understand. Things that slip between the cracks of what we know, hiding in the dark, waiting for someone to notice them. I don't know what we encountered in that house. I don't want to know. But if you ever hear knocking where there shouldn't be any, if you hear water running when no one's home, don't investigate. Don't look for it. Don't acknowledge it. Because once you do, it never lets you go. It was late autumn when I moved into that house. A small, unremarkable two-bedroom on a quiet street in a town that most people wouldn't recognize on a map. The kind of place where the biggest event of the year was the fall festival, where neighbors greeted each other but never really got too involved in one another's business. I had just turned 27 and was finally settling into a life I could call my own. My work kept me busy, long hours, mostly at night. I was a security guard at a local warehouse, which meant I slept during the day and worked when the world was asleep. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid well enough, and I didn't have to deal with too many people. My house was at the end of the street, right before the road cut off into a stretch of woods. That was one of the things that sold me on it. No nosy neighbors behind me, just trees and open space. The rent was cheap, probably because the last tenant left in a hurry. The landlord never said much about why, only that it had been vacant for almost a year. At the time, I didn't care. I liked the solitude. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my nights watching security monitors in a near-empty building, and my days catching up on sleep. The neighborhood was as quiet as I had hoped, with barely any cars passing through. The closest neighbor was 2 houses down, an older man who mostly kept to himself. The house itself was old but in decent shape. The walls were painted a dull off-white, and the floors creaked in some spots. The previous tenant had left behind a few things: a rusted-out bike in the shed, an old wooden chair in the attic, but nothing too unusual. There was something about the place, though, a stillness. I chalked it up to being alone. I had lived with roommates for years, and this was the first time I had an entire house to myself. The silence was just something I had to get used to. Most nights, I would come home just before sunrise, make a quick breakfast, and fall asleep as the rest of the world woke up. The routine became comfortable, predictable. Then, one night, something changed. I had just finished a 12-hour shift and was exhausted. The walk from my car to the front door felt longer than usual. The air had turned colder, and I could see my breath in front of me. As I stepped onto the porch, I noticed something strange. The front door was unlocked. I stopped. I was sure I had locked it before leaving. I always did. A chill ran through me, but I pushed it aside. Maybe I had been in a rush that night and forgot. It wasn't like I had much worth stealing: an old couch, a TV, a fridge full of leftovers. Still, I hesitated before stepping inside. The house was quiet. I flipped on the light. Everything was exactly as I had left it. I checked the windows. Locked. The back door. Locked. I stood in the center of the living room for a while, listening, waiting. Nothing. After a few minutes, I convinced myself it was just exhaustion playing tricks on me. I locked the door, double-checked it this time, then headed straight to my room. I was too tired to think about it anymore. That night, I slept hard, harder than usual. But when I woke up, something felt off. It took me a moment to realize what it was. The bedroom door. It was open. I never slept with it open. Never. I sat up slowly, my pulse picking up. The house was silent, but this time, the silence wasn't comforting. It was thick, heavy, like something was waiting just beyond it. I got out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The air felt colder, even though the heater was running. I checked every room again. The doors were locked, the windows shut. Nothing was out of place. And yet, something was different. The stillness I had felt before wasn't just silence anymore. It was presence, a weight in the air. I told myself I was being paranoid, that I was still half asleep, my brain playing tricks on me. I went about my routine, showered, made breakfast, got ready for work, but that feeling never left. By the time I stepped out the door that evening, the sky was already dark, and a thin mist had settled over the street. I locked the door behind me and stood there for a moment, looking back at the house. I had the sudden urge to leave, to turn around, grab whatever I could, and not come back. I shook it off and got into my car. As I pulled out of the driveway, I glanced at the front window. For a split second, I thought I saw something move inside. A shadow, standing still, watching me. At work, I kept telling myself it was nothing. Just exhaustion, just my mind playing tricks. But for the first time since moving in, I didn't want to go home. I even considered driving past my street when my shift ended, maybe getting a motel room for the night. But that was ridiculous, wasn't it? It was just a house, just another night. And yet, as I pulled into the driveway hours later, the headlights cutting through the mist, my hands tightened on the steering wheel. The house was waiting. Silent. Still. And I had no idea what was inside. I sat in the driveway for longer than I should have, the engine idling as I stared at the front of the house. My breath fogged up the windshield, and for a moment I focused on that, on the way the condensation spread across the glass, blurring the edges of my vision. Anything to keep my eyes off the darkened window. I told myself there was nothing there. Just shadows. Just my own paranoia. I shut off the engine, grabbed my things, and stepped out into the cold night air. The street was as silent as ever, only the faint rustling of the trees in the distance breaking through the stillness. As I walked up the porch steps, my stomach knotted. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was just the way the house stood there, waiting. Or maybe it was that gnawing feeling in the back of my mind, the one that whispered, something isn't right. I reached for the door handle and stopped. The door was unlocked. Again. My chest tightened. I knew I had locked it. I remembered doing it. I had checked, double-checked before leaving. I stood there for a long moment, gripping the handle but not turning it. My ears strained for any sound inside, any sign that someone was waiting for me in the dark. Nothing. I swallowed hard and slowly pushed the door open. The house was silent. Too silent. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. Everything was exactly where I had left it. The couch, the TV, the pile of mail on the small table by the door. There was no sign of a break-in, no drawers rifled through, no footprints on the floor. And yet, the air felt different, like the house had been holding its breath. I let out a slow exhale and rubbed the back of my neck. Maybe I really did forget to lock it. Maybe I was just tired when I left. Still, I grabbed the baseball bat I kept by the coat rack and checked every room. Kitchen. Empty. Bathroom. Empty. Bedroom. I froze in the doorway. The closet door was open. Not just open, wide open. I never left it open. I never even used the closet. My stomach dropped and my grip tightened on the bat. I stepped closer, every muscle in my body bracing for something, anything, to jump out. The closet was dark, the slatted door creaking slightly as I nudged it. Empty. Just the same old shelves, the same bare walls. And yet, that same suffocating feeling pressed down on me. Like something had been there. Like it had been standing in the darkness, waiting. I slammed the door shut, locking it out of instinct. I didn't sleep much that day. Every time I closed my eyes, I swore I heard something. Something shifting just outside my door. Something pressing against the edges of my hearing. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that I had spooked myself over nothing. But as I lay there in the dim morning light, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the thought. I wasn't alone in that house. That night at work, I was restless. Every noise, every flicker of the security monitors made my pulse jump. I wasn't even thinking about the job, barely paying attention to the screens in front of me. Instead, all I could focus on was home. The closet door. The unlocked front door. That feeling of being watched. At some point, I pulled out my phone and started looking up break-ins in the area. Maybe someone had been squatting in my house. Maybe I had just missed the signs. But there was nothing. No reports. No police records. No reason for me to feel the way I did. And yet, as my shift dragged on, an uneasy thought settled in the back of my mind. What if it wasn't a person? When I got home, I hesitated at the door again. I tried to ignore the cold prickle running down my spine as I reached for the lock. This time, it was still locked. That should have comforted me. It didn't. I stepped inside, shutting the door behind me. The house was dark, only the glow from the streetlights filtering through the curtains. I exhaled, trying to shake off the nerves. But then, a creak. I froze. It was coming from the bedroom. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, another creak. Soft, deliberate, like something shifting its weight. I gripped the bat in my hand and took a slow step forward. The house felt different, heavier, like the air itself had thickened. Another creak. I turned the corner into the bedroom. The closet door was open. Again. Wide open. My pulse pounded in my ears. The closet was empty. And yet, I could feel it. That weight. That presence. Like something had been standing there only moments before. Watching. Waiting. I swallowed, my throat dry. I wanted to tell myself I had left it open, that I had somehow forgotten to close it. But I knew better. I had locked it. I was sure of it. I backed out of the room, never taking my eyes off that empty, gaping space. Then, moving quickly, I grabbed a chair from the kitchen and jammed it under the closet door handle. It wasn't much, but it made me feel better. For a while. That night, I barely slept. Every sound sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I kept expecting to hear something. Footsteps, breathing, the slow creak of that closet door sliding open again. But the house was silent. Too silent. I lay awake until the first light of dawn slipped through the blinds. Only then did I let myself drift into an uneasy sleep. When I woke up a few hours later, the first thing I did was check the closet. The chair was still in place. The door was still shut. For the first time in days, I let out a breath of relief. Maybe I had just been imagining things. Maybe I had freaked myself out over nothing. I pulled the chair away, opening the door just to prove to myself that there was nothing inside. Just shelves. Just walls. Nothing else. I felt ridiculous. Shaking my head, I shut the closet door and froze. There, on the inside of the door, something scratched into the wood. 4 letters, carved deep, jagged. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My mind scrambled for an explanation. Had that been there before? Had I somehow never noticed? But no, that was fresh. And I was the only one in that house. The air around me felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like something was watching me. I grabbed my keys and walked straight out the door, locking it behind me. I didn't look back. Didn't stop walking until I was in my car. Hands shaking, I turned the key in the ignition. I needed to go somewhere, anywhere. That wasn't that house. As I backed out of the driveway, my eyes flicked up to the bedroom window. And for just a second, I saw something move. A shadow, standing there, watching me. I didn't go home that night. I couldn't. I ended up driving aimlessly for hours, circling through empty roads, gas stations, and quiet parking lots. The whole time, my mind kept replaying the last thing I saw, that shadow in the window. I had convinced myself it was my imagination. Stress, lack of sleep. But the word scratched into the closet door? That was real. That was something I couldn't explain. I parked in a lot near an all-night diner, slumping in my seat, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles ached. My phone was in my lap, screen dim, waiting. I could call someone. A friend. The cops. But what would I say? Hey, I think my closet might be haunted? No one would believe me. Hell, I barely believed it myself. So I sat there, staring out at the darkened street, the neon glow of the diner sign flickering in the distance. Every few minutes, I looked in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something in the back seat. Nothing. Just me and my own paranoia. At some point, exhaustion won. I tilted my seat back and let my eyes close, telling myself it'd only rest for a little while. Just long enough to clear my head. But sleep didn't bring relief. It brought him. In the dream, I was in my house. The air was thick, suffocating. The walls seemed closer, pressing in around me. Everything was dim, like the light had been drained from the room. I turned toward the hallway, and there he was. A shadow, standing in front of the bedroom door. He didn't move, didn't breathe, just stood there, his outline barely distinguishable from the darkness around him. My chest tightened. My legs felt heavy, like they were sinking into the floor. I wanted to run. I needed to run, but I couldn't. Then, slowly, he started to move. Not walking, gliding, silent, straight toward me. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. Closer. His face, or what should have been a face, was nothing but an empty void. Black. Endless. I squeezed my eyes shut. And then, I woke up. Gasping. Heart pounding. The car was cold. My breath came out in sharp, panicked bursts, fogging up the windshield. My fingers trembled as I gripped the steering wheel, trying to ground myself. Just a dream. Just a dream. But when I looked down at my hands, my stomach dropped. There were scratches on my forearm. Thin, red lines. Fresh. I ran a shaking hand over them, feeling the sting. No! No, that wasn't from me. I hadn't done that. A cold shiver ran through me. Something was wrong. I forced myself to drive home the next morning. I didn't want to. Every fiber of my being screamed at me to turn around, to leave, to never go back. But I had to. I couldn't just abandon my house. The street was empty when I pulled up. The same eerie stillness hung over the neighborhood, the same oppressive quiet that had started to feel too heavy, too unnatural. I hesitated before stepping out of the car. My eyes flicked up to my bedroom window. Nothing. No shadow. No movement. Still, my hands shook as I unlocked the front door. Inside, everything looked normal. No overturned furniture. No signs of forced entry. And yet, the air felt off. Thicker. Heavier. Like something unseen was pressing against my skin. I checked the closet first. The door was still closed. The scratches on the inside were still there. But now, there was more. Not just leave. Another word. Scratched directly beneath it. Stay. I stepped back, my throat dry. My pulse pounded in my ears. It didn't make sense. Two messages. Opposing. As if two things were fighting over me. A wave of dizziness hit me, and I gripped the wall for support. I needed answers, and I knew where to start. The attic. I never used the attic. Didn't even think about it most days. It was just there, a forgotten space above the house, filled with dust and forgotten junk. But now, standing beneath the pull-down ladder, I felt a cold weight settle in my stomach. Something about that space had started to nag at me, like it was important, like it was hiding something. I reached up, pulling the ladder down. It unfolded with a creak, the sound echoing through the empty house. A wave of dust rained down, making me cough. The air smelled stale, untouched for years. I hesitated, gripping the ladder. Then, taking a slow breath, I climbed up. The attic was dark. My flashlight cut through the gloom, illuminating wooden beams, old furniture covered in sheets, and stacks of decaying boxes. For a moment, nothing seemed out of place. Just an ordinary attic. But then, a sound, soft, like something shifting in the farthest corner. I froze, my breath catching. My flashlight trembled in my grip as I aimed it toward the sound. At first, I saw nothing, just dust swirling in the beam of light. Then I saw it. A small wooden door, half hidden behind a stack of old boxes. My stomach twisted. I had never seen that door before, had never even known it existed. Slowly, I stepped toward it, the floorboards groaning beneath me. Dust swirled in the dim light as I reached out and brushed my fingers over the wood. The door was old, much older than the rest of the attic. And the handle, cold, ice cold, like it hadn't been touched in decades. I swallowed hard. My gut screamed at me to leave it alone. but I couldn't. I gripped the handle and turned. The door creaked open. A rush of cold air spilled out, unnatural, freezing. I lifted my flashlight, shining it into the darkness beyond, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It wasn't a room. It was a crawl space, and inside, carved into the wood, were more words. Dozens of them. Hundreds. Some overlapping. Some scratched so deep they had splintered the wood. All saying the same thing. Over and over. Don't let him in. A sharp bang echoed through the attic. I spun around, heart slamming into my ribs. The sound had come from the entrance. From below, my breath caught in my throat. Something was down there. Something was waiting. I turned back to the crawlspace, my flashlight flickering. And in that brief moment of darkness, I saw it. A shape. A shadow. Curling in the back of the crawlspace. The whispers still clung to the air, sinking into my skin like ice. He's already here. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering in my ears. The flashlight flickered again, its beam stuttering across the crawlspace. The shadow, whatever it was still there. No shape, no face, just a mass of darkness, deeper than the shadows around it. Watching me, waiting. I took a slow step back, my body rigid, my fingers numb around the flashlight. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of the attic. But then, the ladder. It slammed shut. A deafening bang as it folded up into the ceiling, sealing me inside. I flinched, nearly dropping the flashlight. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I turned, my heart in my throat, my hands shaking as I reached for the pull string. I yanked it. Nothing. The door wouldn't budge. I yanked harder. Still nothing. I was trapped. The air thickened, pressing against my chest. The attic suddenly felt smaller, the walls closing in, the darkness growing heavier. Behind me, a sound. A soft, slow scrape against the wooden floor. My stomach clenched. I turned, flashlight shaking. The crawlspace was empty. The shadow was gone. The breath hitched in my throat. My hands trembled so badly the flashlight beam danced across the attic. No, it couldn't just be gone. It was here. Somewhere. Watching. Waiting. The attic suddenly felt unbearably cold. The kind of cold that seeped into your bones, that filled your lungs with ice. I backed up toward the entrance, my fingers still clawing at the attic door. Then, the whisper came again. But this time, it was closer, right behind me. A sharp, paralyzing chill ran down my spine. My throat clenched, locking my breath inside my chest. I could feel it. Something was behind me, standing so close I should have felt breath on my neck, if it had breath at all. I couldn't turn, couldn't look, but I had to. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I forced myself to turn my head, and he was there. Not a shadow anymore, not just a shape in the darkness. He was real, standing inches from me, towering, hollow, empty. No face, no eyes, just a void where a person should have been. A mass of blackness in the shape of a man, shifting, moving like smoke, like it wasn't solid, like it was never meant to be here. The flashlight sputtered again, and in that split second of darkness, something touched me. A hand, if it could be called that, gripped my wrist. Cold! So unbearably cold. The feeling was instant, like my blood had turned to ice, like my bones were cracking beneath the pressure. I gasped, my knees buckling, and then I was falling. Down, down, through the attic door. The wood split open beneath me, and I crashed through, hitting the floor below with a bone-jarring thud. Pain shot through my shoulder, my ribs. My head smacked against the hardwood. The air left my lungs in a sharp, wheezing gasp. The attic door swung wildly above me, the ladder now fully extended, like it had never been locked at all. I scrambled backward, my body screaming in pain, my vision blurring. The flashlight rolled across the floor, its beam flickering wildly across the ceiling. Then I saw him, standing in the attic entrance. Still, silent, watching me, a shape of nothingness, a hole in reality itself. And then he moved, slowly, methodically, stepping down the ladder, toward me. My breath hitched. I pushed myself up, ignoring the searing pain in my side, my head spinning. I had to move. I had to get out of here. I turned, half stumbling, half crawling toward the front door. My vision swam, my heartbeat thundered in my ears. Behind me, footsteps, heavy, deliberate, following. I reached the door, fumbling with the lock, my hands slick with sweat, shaking so badly I could barely grip the handle. The air behind me shifted. A weight, a presence, right there. I yanked the door open and threw myself outside, tumbling onto the porch, crashing down the steps. Cold night air hit my face. My lungs burned as I gasped, scrambling onto my hands and knees, heart slamming against my ribs. I twisted around, but the doorway was empty. No one was there. The house was silent. Still, like nothing had ever happened, like I had imagined it all. But the pain in my body was real. The scratches on my arm were real. And when I looked down at my wrist, at the place where he had grabbed me, there was a mark, a deep, blackened print, like frostbite, like something had seeped into my skin, something that wasn't leaving. I stumbled to my car, my legs barely holding me up. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I didn't look back. I couldn't. I wouldn't. I started the engine, my fingers still trembling, my wrist aching, the blackened mark burning like a brand. And as I pulled away from the house, speeding down the empty street, I knew this wasn't over. It would never be over, because he was still there. And somehow, someway, he had followed me. I didn't stop driving, didn't look at the house in the rearview mirror, didn't even try to think. I just drove. My knuckles turned white around the steering wheel, my wrist still burning with that mark. I felt it under my sleeve, cold, pulsing like it was alive. But I couldn't look at it. Not yet. The streets were empty. The streetlights cast long, pale streaks across the pavement, flickering as I passed under them. The road stretched ahead, endless and silent, and for the first time in my life, I hated the quiet, because now I knew I wasn't alone. I kept the headlights on high, eyes darting between the road and the mirrors, scanning every shadow, every dark corner where something could be. My thoughts raced. Had it followed me? Was it already inside the car? The idea made my stomach twist, my hands tighten on the wheel. The engine hummed, the only sound against the suffocating silence. But then, a flicker in the mirror, a shape in the back seat. I slammed the brakes. Tires screeched. My body lurched forward. The car skidded to a stop in the middle of the road. Heart hammering, I turned slowly, barely breathing. The back seat was empty. No shadows, no figure, no one. But I felt it. I knew it was there, watching, waiting. I sucked in a shaky breath, my fingers trembling as I gripped the gear shift. I had to get away, had to keep moving. I threw the car into drive and hit the gas, speeding down the road, my mind screaming at me to get as far away as possible. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station on the edge of town. Bright lights, people, safety, or at least the illusion of it. I pulled into a parking space, cut the engine, and let out a long, unsteady breath. My body ached, my muscles stiff from tension. My wrist still throbbed. I needed to see it. Slowly, I rolled up my sleeve. The mark was still there. A dark, jagged print, almost like a hand, but not quite. The edges were uneven, spreading like frostbite across my skin. It didn't hurt. Not exactly, but it felt wrong, like it didn't belong to me, like it was something else entirely. A shiver crawled down my spine. I reached for my phone, fingers shaking as I typed into the search bar. Black handprint mark after paranormal encounter. The results loaded. I scanned the page, heart pounding. Mark of attachment. Entity connection. Once touched, it doesn't let go. I swallowed hard, my mouth dry. My eyes darted to the reflection in the gas station window. I didn't want to look, but I had to. I had to know. And when I did, the breath caught in my throat. Behind me, in the reflection, a shadow, standing just outside the car, waiting. I didn't sleep that night. Didn't go home. Didn't go anywhere I had been before. I checked into a motel on the other side of town, one with fluorescent lights that buzzed all night, where the sound of passing cars filled the silence. But the feeling didn't go away. The mark didn't fade. And when I turned off the lights, I wasn't alone. The shadows moved when they shouldn't. The air felt heavy, thick with something unseen. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt a weight pressing down on my chest, as if something was hovering just above me. Watching. Waiting. By the third night, I stopped trying to sleep. Stopped pretending I could escape it. Because I knew the truth now. The house wasn't haunted. It wasn't the place that was cursed. It was me. And whatever had touched me, it wasn't letting go. It's been weeks. Maybe months. I've stopped keeping track of time. Not because I don't want to, but because time doesn't feel real anymore. The days blur together, and the nights. The nights are something else entirely. I still see it. Not all the time. Not always in the same way. But it's there. Sometimes in reflections, like a smudge on the mirror that won't wipe away. A shape that lingers just outside my vision. Sometimes in the dark corners of a room where the light doesn't quite reach. A shift in the shadows. A presence I feel before I see. And sometimes, most times, it's not something I see at all. It's the sensation of being watched. The feeling of cold air on the back of my neck when there's no breeze. The sound of breathing in an empty room. At first, I tried to fight it. Tried to pretend it wasn't real. I moved motels, changed numbers, burned my old clothes. Even thought about going back to the house, maybe to break whatever connection I had made. But I knew it wouldn't work. Because the house was never the problem. It was me. And it still is. I don't dream anymore. Not in the way I used to. When I sleep, if I sleep, I find myself somewhere else. A vast, empty place with no walls, no ceiling, just darkness stretching forever. And it's there, waiting, not moving, not speaking, just watching. I don't know what it wants. Maybe it doesn't want anything. Maybe it just is. And maybe, somehow, I belong to it now. I tell myself that as long as I keep moving, as long as I never settle in one place for too long, it'll be okay. But deep down, I know the truth. It's with me no matter where I go, no matter how far I run, no matter how much I pretend. Because once it touches you, it never lets go. It started when I moved into an old rental house in a small town I had never heard of before. The kind of town where nothing much happens. The kind of town people pass through on their way to somewhere else. I had taken a job there, something temporary, just until I figured things out. The house was cheap, cheaper than anything else in the area. and the landlord seemed almost too eager to get someone to rent it. I should have known something was off, but at the time, I wasn't thinking about any of that. I just needed a place to stay. The house itself wasn't anything special. A single-story place with peeling white paint and a yard that hadn't seen a lawnmower in months. The front porch sagged slightly, and one of the steps creaked under my weight every time I walked on it. Inside, it was the kind of house that felt abandoned even when you were standing in it. The walls were bare, the floors scuffed and uneven. The air smelled stale, like no one had lived there for a long time. I had only a few pieces of furniture when I moved in: a bed, a couch, a small table. Enough to get by. My days were routine: work, home, sleep, repeat. The first few nights, everything seemed normal. Quiet, even. The kind of quiet you don't get in a city. No traffic, no sirens, just the sound of the wind through the trees and the occasional creak of the house settling. It should have been peaceful. It should have helped me sleep. But it didn't. From the very first night, something felt wrong. It wasn't anything obvious at first, just a feeling. A heaviness in the air, like the house was pressing down on me. I told myself it was in my head, that I was just getting used to a new place. But that feeling never went away. If anything, it got worse. I started waking up in the middle of the night for no reason. Not because of a noise, not because of a bad dream, just waking up. Heart pounding, breath shallow, staring into the dark like something was there. But every time I turned on the light, the room was empty. I told myself it was stress. I was tired. My mind was playing tricks on me. Then, little things started happening. Things I couldn't explain. The front door would be unlocked in the morning, even though I knew I had locked it the night before. I would find the kitchen cabinets open when I came home from work. My phone charger would be unplugged. My shoes moved to a different spot. Small things. Easy to brush off. Maybe I had forgotten. Maybe I had done it without thinking. But then, there were the nights. The nights were the worst. There was a sound. Not loud, not even constant. Just there. A soft shuffle, like footsteps on carpet. Except the house didn't have any carpet. Or a faint tap, like something knocking on wood. It never happened when I was fully awake, only when I was half asleep, drifting in that space between dreams and reality. I would hear it, sit up, listen. Nothing. But the moment I laid back down, there it was again. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped feeling rested. It was as if the house didn't want me to sleep, like it wanted me to be aware of it. Then, one night, I saw something. It wasn't much. Just a shadow, darker than the rest of the room, standing in the hallway outside my bedroom door. I only saw it for a second before I blinked and it was gone. I sat up, heart racing, staring at the empty space where it had been. I wanted to believe it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Something was in that house with me, and it was just getting started. I don't know when exactly I started feeling watched, but once I noticed it, I couldn't ignore it. It wasn't the kind of feeling you get when you know someone is looking at you from across the room. This was different. This was heavier, like something was breathing down my neck, standing just out of my line of sight. I would sit on the couch after work, scrolling through my phone, and the sensation would creep up on me. My skin would prickle, and my heartbeat would pick up even though I couldn't explain why. The first incident that made me question everything happened about 2 weeks after I moved in. It was a Friday night, and I was exhausted from work. I had picked up some takeout on my way home and sat down in front of the TV, eating straight from the container. The place was silent except for the occasional sound of my fork scraping against the bottom of the box. I wasn't even watching what was on the screen, just letting the noise fill the emptiness. Then I heard it. A click! It wasn't loud, just a soft sound from somewhere behind me, like a doorknob turning, but stopping before the latch released. I froze mid-bite and listened. Nothing. The house was quiet. Maybe it had been the pipes or the wind outside. I forced myself to keep eating, telling myself I was just on edge from not sleeping well. But then it happened again. Click. This time, I set my food down. The sound had come from the hallway near my bedroom. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something standing there. The hallway was dark, the door to my room slightly open like I had left it. I hadn't turned on the hallway light, so the doorway was just a black void. I stared at it, waiting. Nothing. I exhaled and shook my head. I was being ridiculous. Maybe the old wood in the house was settling. Maybe my mind was making things up. I turned back to my food, but I had lost my appetite. A few hours later, I was getting ready for bed when something else happened. I had just brushed my teeth and turned off the bathroom light when I felt the air shift. You know that sensation when someone walks past you and you feel the slight displacement of air? That's exactly what it felt like. Except I was alone. I stood there, my hand still on the light switch, my breath caught in my throat. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was real. I turned my head slowly, my eyes scanning the dark hallway. There was nothing there, but the feeling didn't go away. For the first time since moving in, I felt uneasy in my own home. I shook it off, refusing to let my nerves get the best of me. I went to my room, shut the door, and got into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. Every time I started drifting off, I would jolt awake, heart racing, as if something had just moved in the room. Then came the knocking. 3 soft taps. I sat up so fast my head spun. My first instinct was to check my phone. Maybe I had imagined it. Maybe I had been dreaming. But my screen showed the time, 2:47 a.m., and nothing else. I held my breath and listened. The house was silent. Then, again, tap, tap, tap. It wasn't loud, not aggressive, just deliberate. Like someone knocking on my bedroom door, waiting to be let in. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. My bedroom door was closed. I always closed it before bed. But that sound, it had come from inside the room. I reached for the lamp on my nightstand, my fingers fumbling with the switch. The moment light filled the room, the knocking stopped. I scanned every inch of my surroundings. The closet door was shut. The window was locked. Nothing seemed out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been in there with me, watching me while I slept. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I told myself it had been a dream. Stress. Sleep deprivation. My mind playing tricks on me. But I couldn't ignore the uneasy feeling that settled in my chest. The house wasn't just old. It wasn't just creaky floors and faulty locks. Something was wrong with it. Something I couldn't explain. And it was just getting started. After that night, things in the house started to change. Or maybe they had always been like that, and I had just been too tired or distracted to notice. At first, it was small things. A drawer in the kitchen would be open when I was sure I had closed it. The bathroom light would be on when I knew I had turned it off. I started second-guessing myself, wondering if I was just being forgetful. I even started keeping track of things, mentally noting what lights I turned off, what doors I shut, just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing my mind. But the house had other plans. One evening, I was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels, when I heard something move behind me. Not a creak or a tap. Movement, a distinct shifting of weight, like someone stepping onto the hardwood floor. I turned my head so fast my neck cracked. There was nothing there. I stared at the spot behind the couch for a long time, waiting for something, anything to happen. My heartbeat pounded in my ears, and for the first time, I felt genuinely afraid. I wasn't just imagining things. Something was there. The next night, I decided to do something stupid. I tried talking to it. I was standing in the kitchen, washing a glass, when I felt that same heavy presence pressing against my back. The air had gone still, too still, like the house was holding its breath. I turned off the faucet and slowly dried my hands. Then, with my back still turned, I forced the words out. "What do you want?" The silence stretched. I could hear my own breathing, shaky and uneven. My hands clenched around the damp towel. I felt like something was standing just inches away, watching me, waiting. Then, from the hallway, a single, deliberate knock. I spun around, my chest tight with panic. The hallway was empty, just the dark doorway to my room staring back at me. My legs felt locked in place, but I forced myself to move, to check. I turned on every light as I went. The house was empty. That was the first night I slept with my bedroom light on. Things got worse. The knocking didn't stop. Some nights it was from the hallway. Other nights it was on my closet door. Once it was on my nightstand, right next to my head. But the worst part, the whispers started. At first, I thought it was just the wind outside, or maybe even the house settling, but it wasn't. I would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of soft, hushed voices. Too faint to understand, too close to be from outside. It was as if someone was standing right outside my bedroom door, murmuring just loud enough for me to hear, but not enough to make out the words. One night, I snapped. I had barely slept in days. The whispers, the knocking, the constant feeling of being watched had worn me down. So when I woke up at 3:12 a.m. to the sound of low, unintelligible voices outside my room, I threw the covers off and stormed to the door. I yanked it open, heart hammering, fully prepared to see something. But the hallway was empty. The air was cold, unnaturally so. My breath came out in a faint puff of condensation, and the floor beneath me felt like ice. My skin crawled. Then, just as I was about to step back into my room, a shadow moved. Not mine. It flickered at the end of the hallway, just beyond the reach of the dim overhead light. Not walking, not drifting, but shifting. I slammed the door shut and locked it. That was the night I decided I needed answers. Investigating the house. The next day, I took the morning off work. I needed to know what was happening, why this house felt wrong. I started with the most obvious place, the basement. I had only been down there once when I first moved in. It was mostly empty, just some old wooden shelves and a washing machine. But something about it had always felt off. The air down there was different, heavy, like walking through water. I grabbed a flashlight and headed down. The wooden stairs creaked under my weight, each step sending an uneasy shiver up my spine. The basement was just as I remembered it, bare concrete floor, exposed wooden beams, a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. But the moment I stepped off the last stair, I felt it. The air was wrong. It was thick, almost suffocating, like stepping into a room that hadn't been opened in decades. My flashlight beam cut through the dimness, landing on the empty shelves, the water heater, the cracked cement wall at the far end. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just dirt, but when I stepped closer, my stomach dropped. Scratches. Long, jagged scratches along the cement wall, as if something had been dragged down it over and over again. My chest tightened. I ran my fingers over them. The grooves were deep, uneven, not the kind made by an animal. These had been made by hands. A sudden creak behind me made me whip around, flashlight shaking in my grip. The basement stairs loomed in the dim light. Empty, but I wasn't alone. I felt it before I heard it, a shift in the air. A presence standing too close behind me. My skin went cold, my breath hitched. Then, a breath, right against my ear. I bolted up the stairs, taking them two at a time, nearly tripping in my panic. I didn't stop until I was back in the kitchen, my chest heaving. I locked the basement door, double-checked it, and sat at the table, my hands shaking. Something was in this house, and it wanted me to know. I didn't go into the basement again after that. I couldn't. But that didn't stop whatever was in the house from coming to me. The knocking got louder, more aggressive. The whispers turned into murmurs, then into something closer to speech, though the words were still impossible to understand. I barely slept. Every night was the same. It lay in bed, heart pounding, waiting. And without fail, around 3 a.m., it would begin. A knock, then another, then footsteps. But the moment I turned on the light, silence. It was a game. A sick, twisted game, and I was the only player. But then, one night, everything changed. I woke up suddenly, my body stiff, my breath shallow. The air was thick, suffocating. The kind of heat that shouldn't exist in the middle of the night. My sheets clung to my skin, damp with sweat. Then I heard it. Breathing. Not mine. Not outside my door. Inside my room. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe. I just listened. It was slow, deep, deliberate, as if whoever or whatever was standing there wanted me to know it was there. My fingers twitched toward my bedside lamp. I hesitated. If I turned it on, what would I see? But I couldn't just lay there. I clenched my jaw, took a slow, shaky breath, and switched on the light. The room was empty, or so I thought. Something felt wrong. The air was charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. My skin prickled. My heart hammered against my ribs. And then, a shadow shifted. Not on the wall, on the ceiling. I didn't look up. I couldn't. I wanted to run, wanted to bolt out of that room, but I was frozen in place, every nerve screaming at me to not look up. But then the breathing stopped. And in that moment of silence, something dropped from the ceiling. I didn't see it. I didn't need to. The air moved, something heavy hit the floor, and I felt it, standing right next to my bed. I threw myself off the mattress, scrambling toward the door. My fingers fumbled with the handle, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I yanked it open, stumbled into the hallway, and slammed it shut behind me. Silence! Then, a slow, deliberate knock from the other side. I ran. I didn't stop running until I was out of the house. I didn't grab my keys, my phone, nothing. I just ran barefoot into the street, sucking in gulps of cold air. The house loomed behind me, its dark windows staring down like empty eyes. And then, the front door opened. Not all the way, just a crack. I stared, heart pounding, waiting for something to step out. But nothing did. The door simply stood there, open just enough to let me know that it was still watching. I didn't go back inside that night. I couldn't. Instead, I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The sun couldn't come up fast enough. But as I sat there, staring at the house, a realization hit me. It had let me leave. Every night before, no matter how scared I was, I had always stayed. I had played its game. But tonight, the moment I ran, it let me go, because it knew it'd have to come back. I lived there, and it was waiting. I didn't step foot back into the house until morning. Even then, it wasn't by choice. I sat in my car for hours, watching as the sky slowly turned from deep black to the muted grays of dawn, and finally to the dull gold of morning. The entire time, I debated whether I should just leave everything behind, find a motel, call a friend, sleep in the car if I had to. But I couldn't. My phone was inside, my wallet, my keys. I couldn't just disappear. Besides, part of me knew that if I left for good, it'd never get the answers I needed. So as the sun rose, I took a deep breath and stepped out of my car. The house was silent. No knocks, no whispers, no shifting shadows. For the first time in weeks, it felt normal. But that didn't make me feel better. If anything, it made me more afraid. I stood on the front porch, hand on the doorknob, heart hammering in my chest. Was it waiting for me? Had it followed me outside? Or had it finally left? There was only one way to find out. I stepped inside. The door creaked as I closed it behind me. Sunlight streamed in through the windows, illuminating the space in a way I hadn't seen in a while. For the first time, I noticed just how much the house had changed me. Dishes piled up in the sink, dust settling on surfaces I hadn't cleaned in weeks. The couch cushions were still flipped over from the night I spent sleeping there, too afraid to go to my room. My bedroom door was open, wide open. I hadn't left it like that. My stomach tightened, but I forced myself to move. If it was still here, I needed to know. I checked every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. The house was empty, or at least it seemed that way. Even though I found nothing, the house felt different. It wasn't just in my head. The air was lighter. The silence didn't feel oppressive. It was as if whatever had been here was gone. Or maybe it was just hiding. I didn't know what to do. Should I pack my things and leave? Pretend none of this ever happened? Or should I stay, hoping that whatever had haunted me was finally finished? I wanted to believe that the nightmare was over. But then, as I stood in my bedroom, staring at the ceiling where I had felt it hanging over me, I noticed something strange. A small handprint. Not mine. Not even an adult's. It was too small. And it was blackened, like soot or ash, pressed into the paint just above my bed. I backed away slowly, my pulse quickening. I didn't touch it. I didn't have to. I already knew what it meant. I packed that night. I didn't take much, just enough to get me through the next few days. I booked a cheap motel, grabbed my essentials, and walked out the front door without looking back. I told myself it'd come back when I was ready, that it'd figure out what was really going on. But deep down, I knew the truth. The house didn't want me to leave, and something told me it wasn't finished with me yet. I never went back. I told myself I would. I even kept paying rent for a while, as if that somehow meant I was still in control, that the house was still mine. But deep down, I knew I had already lost. The motel became my new home. It wasn't much, but it was safe. The first few nights, I barely slept, expecting to hear the knocks again, waiting for that slow, deliberate breathing to find me in the dark. But nothing happened. The silence was the loudest thing I had heard in weeks. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was still waiting. I thought about it constantly. The walls, the basement, the smell of rotting wood that never went away, no matter how many times I scrubbed. The handprint above my bed. Was it still there? Had it faded? Or had it grown? I don't know what would have happened if I had stayed. I don't want to know. But sometimes, in the middle of the night, I wake up thinking I hear something. A knock! Or the faint sound of breathing. And I wonder, did I leave the house? Or did the house leave with me? I never thought I'd have anything worth sharing, nothing that would keep someone up at night. But that changed when I moved into an old house on the outskirts of a quiet town. It was supposed to be a fresh start, a place to finally have my own space. A small rental with an affordable price tag, sitting at the edge of a dense tree line. Looking back now, I should have questioned why the rent was so low. At the time, I convinced myself it was a steal. I didn't have much, just a few boxes of clothes, a secondhand couch, and a mattress that had seen better days. But it was mine. I worked long hours at a repair shop in town, fixing up old engines and replacing busted parts. It wasn't glamorous, but it paid the bills. My days were filled with grease-stained hands, the smell of oil, and the constant hum of tools. The house was supposed to be a quiet place to unwind after work. It was just me. No roommates, no noisy neighbors. The kind of solitude most people would kill for. The house itself was old, but not in a charming way. The wooden floors creaked even when no one was walking on them. The windows rattled slightly whenever the wind picked up. The walls had faint stains, like water damage that had been painted over a few too many times. Still, I chalked it up to age. Nothing out of the ordinary. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd come home, shower, eat whatever leftovers I had, and crash on the couch with the TV on. My routine was simple. Work, eat, sleep, repeat. The house had a strange smell at first, something musty, like damp wood that never quite dried. I left the windows open during the day, hoping the fresh air would help. It didn't. The scent clung to everything, seeping into my clothes, my sheets, even my skin. But I figured it was just an old house thing, nothing to stress over. I didn't notice anything strange until about a week in. It started small, so small I almost brushed it off entirely. Keys not being where I left them. A cabinet door slightly open when I was sure it closed it. The faucet in the bathroom dripping, even though I had tightened it the night before. Nothing worth freaking out over. Just little things. Things that could be explained. But those little things, they kept happening. I started waking up in the middle of the night, feeling like something had pulled me out of sleep. No sounds, no nightmares, just this strange awareness. Like I wasn't alone. Like something had shifted in the room while I was unconscious. I'd lie there, staring at the ceiling, waiting for my heart to slow down before drifting back into sleep. I told myself it was just the stress of moving, that I wasn't used to being completely alone. The human brain does weird things in silence. It looks for patterns, for explanations, even when there aren't any. At work, I didn't think about the house. I focused on tightening bolts, replacing spark plugs, making sure customers got their cars back in working order. But the moment I pulled into the driveway each night, a strange heaviness settled over me. Like the house itself was watching. I shook it off. It was a house. Wood and nails and insulation. Nothing more. Then, one night, something happened that I couldn't ignore. I had just gotten home from a late shift, exhausted and ready to pass out. I kicked off my boots by the door, tossed my jacket over a chair, and collapsed onto the couch. The TV buzzed softly in the background as I scrolled through my phone, barely paying attention. Then I heard it. A soft shuffle. Not from outside. Not from the wind. From inside the house. I sat up, heart pounding, straining to listen. Silence! I told myself it was nothing. Maybe the house settling. Maybe a rat in the walls. But as I stood to turn off the TV, I saw something that made my stomach drop. The door to the hallway, the one leading to my bedroom, was open. I never left it open. I stood there, staring at the open door to the hallway, my body tense. I knew for a fact I hadn't left it open. I always shut it before crashing on the couch. It was just one of those habits. Something about having it closed made the house feel smaller, less empty. But now, it was wide open. A deep, creeping discomfort settled over me. I wasn't the paranoid type. But something about this felt off. I told myself it was nothing. Maybe I had left it open and just didn't remember. Maybe a draft from one of the windows had nudged it open. I took a slow step forward, my bare feet pressing into the cold wooden floor. The air in the hallway felt different, heavier. I reached for the light switch on the wall, flicking it on. The bulbs buzzed to life, flooding the space with dim yellow light. Nothing looked out of place. The hallway led to my bedroom, a spare room I barely used, and the bathroom. Everything was where it should be. I let out a breath, shaking my head at myself. I walked to my bedroom, glancing inside. The bed was unmade, the same way I had left it. The closet door was shut. The window was locked. I stepped inside and checked under the bed, empty. Just dust and an old sock I hadn't bothered picking up. I felt stupid for getting worked up over a door. Still, I shut it again, this time making sure the latch clicked. Back in the living room, I grabbed the remote and turned off the TV, leaving the room in near darkness except for the faint glow from a street lamp outside. I made my way back to my room, shutting the door behind me once more before getting into bed. But sleep didn't come easily. I kept replaying the image of that open door in my head. It had felt intentional, like it hadn't just swung open on its own. Eventually, exhaustion won out, and I drifted into a restless sleep. The next morning, everything seemed normal. The door was still closed. No strange noises. No weird feelings. Just another day. I shook off the lingering unease from the night before, convincing myself it was all in my head. At work, I didn't think about it. I focused on repairing a busted radiator, chatting with a few regular customers, and grabbing lunch from the same corner diner I always did. By the time I pulled into my driveway that evening, the previous night felt like a distant memory. That was until I stepped inside. The air felt thick, like the house had been holding its breath. The smell, the same musty, damp scent, seemed stronger. Then I noticed it. The hallway door was open again. I stood frozen in the doorway, my heart hammering. I was sure I had closed it that morning before leaving. I walked over slowly, my pulse thudding in my ears. I checked the windows, locked. The front door, secure. No sign of forced entry. But something wasn't right. The blanket from the couch was on the floor, crumpled into a heap. The remote was missing from the coffee table. I searched around, eventually finding it under the couch. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe I had kicked the blanket off in my sleep. Maybe the remote had just slipped off. But the door. I went to my room again. Everything looked the same as before, but I could feel something in the air. A presence, almost. I shut the door, locked it this time, and went about my night. I didn't sleep well. A few nights later, things escalated. I had gotten into the habit of double-checking the doors, making sure everything was locked before bed. It gave me some peace of mind, even if I still felt uneasy in the house. That night, I fell asleep earlier than usual. The weight of exhaustion kept my thoughts from spiraling too much. But something woke me. A noise! A soft creak. I lay still, my body stiff. The sound had come from just outside my room. My mind raced through possibilities. Maybe the house settling. Maybe an animal outside. Then came another noise. A quiet tap, like fingers against wood. Right outside my door. I felt a chill crawl down my spine. My breath slowed as I strained to listen. Every muscle in my body tensed. Silence. Then, click. The door handle. I bolted upright, my heart pounding against my ribs. The knob had turned. I couldn't move. I just stared at the door, waiting, hoping I had imagined it. Then, the handle shifted again. A slow, deliberate movement. Someone was on the other side. My mind screamed at me to do something, to grab something, to brace myself. But I was frozen. Then, just as quickly as it started, it stopped. Silence! I stayed like that for what felt like an eternity, my pulse roaring in my ears. Finally, after what had to be an hour, exhaustion pulled me under again. I woke up to daylight streaming through the curtains. For a moment, I convinced myself it had been a dream, that none of it had actually happened. But when I got up and stepped into the hallway, my stomach twisted. The door was open, and the blanket from the couch was crumpled on the floor again. The door was open. The blanket was on the floor again. I stood there, staring at the mess in the living room, my pulse hammering in my throat. At this point, it wasn't just paranoia. Something was happening in this house. I forced myself to take a breath, steadying my hands. Maybe I had been sleepwalking. Maybe I had done all of this myself and just didn't remember. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. I needed answers. That night, I decided to stay awake. I turned off all the lights and sat in the armchair in the living room, my back against the wall where I had a clear view of the hallway. My phone was in my hand, the flashlight ready to go. Hours passed. The house was still. The only sounds were the occasional creaks of the old wooden floors settling. I stared at the hallway door, waiting. Then, at exactly 2:43 a.m., I heard it. A faint tap. My breath caught in my throat. It was soft, deliberate, like something testing the wood. Then another tap, and another. It was coming from the other side of the hallway door. I clenched my phone tighter. My gut told me to run, but I forced myself to stay put. I needed to see what was doing this. Then, click. The door handle turned. I flicked on my phone's flashlight, aiming it at the door. The handle stopped moving. Silence! The air in the room felt thick, pressing down on me. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. Then the door creaked open, slowly. An inch! 2 inches. I held my breath, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. But nothing was there. The hallway was empty. I swallowed hard and stood up, my legs shaky. My fingers felt numb as I reached out and pushed the door fully open. The hallway stretched before me, untouched. My bedroom door was shut. The spare room was dark. I stepped inside, scanning the walls, the floor. Then my eyes landed on the bathroom door. It was open. I knew for a fact I had closed it. I took a slow step toward it, my phone shaking slightly in my grip. The dim beam of light revealed the inside, just the sink, the toilet, the mirror reflecting my own pale face. Nothing else. I let out a shaky breath. Then I heard the sound. From behind me, a whisper, low, almost like breathing. I spun around, my flashlight sweeping across the hallway, empty. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it. Something was in the house with me. The next morning, I barely touched my breakfast. My appetite was gone. I needed to figure out what was going on. I started by checking every single lock, window, and vent. Everything was secure. No forced entry. No signs of an animal. Nothing. Next, I went through the house room by room, looking for anything out of place. The spare room was still mostly empty, except for a few boxes I hadn't unpacked yet. I opened one of the boxes. Inside were old books, some clothes, and a few framed pictures. Nothing unusual. Then I found something odd. A key. It was old, tarnished, with a rusted handle. But I didn't remember ever seeing it before. I turned it over in my hand, frowning. What was it for? I tried it in the front door. It didn't fit. I tried it in the bedroom door. Nothing. Then I thought of the basement. I hadn't been down there since I moved in. There was no reason to. I didn't store anything there. And honestly, basements always creep me out. But now, holding that key, I had the overwhelming feeling that I needed to go down there. The door to the basement was in the kitchen, tucked into the far wall. I hesitated before gripping the knob. It was locked. Heart pounding, I slid the old key into the lock and turned it. Click. The door creaked open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. A musty, damp smell drifted up from below. I grabbed a flashlight and took a slow step down. The wooden steps groaned under my weight. The basement was cold, much colder than the rest of the house. I swept the flashlight across the space. Old shelves lined the walls, covered in dust. There were a few pieces of old furniture, some broken chairs, and a pile of tattered cloth in the corner. But then my light landed on something. A door. It was at the far end of the basement, barely visible in the dim glow of my flashlight. I swallowed, stepping closer. The door was made of wood, its paint peeling. There was no handle, just a keyhole. I reached for the old key again, my fingers trembling. I slid it in. It fit. I hesitated for a long moment, my breath shallow. Then, slowly, I turned the key. Click. The door creaked open. The air inside was thick, stale. My flashlight flickered. I aimed the beam inside, my pulse thundering. And then, I saw it. A figure, standing in the corner. Tall, motionless, watching me. The flashlight flickered again, and then the door slammed shut. The door slammed shut so hard that dust rained from the ceiling. I stumbled back, heart hammering against my ribs, my breath caught in my throat. I was trapped. The flashlight flickered in my grip, the beam weak and unsteady as I aimed it at the wooden door. I turned the knob, yanking hard, but it wouldn't budge. From the other side, the air felt thick, heavy, like something was pressing against the door, keeping it shut. And then, the whispering started again. Not from behind the door, not from the basement above me, from inside the room. I turned slowly, my breath shallow, my body frozen in place. The figure was still there, standing in the far corner. Only now it had moved. Before, it had been a shadow, something barely noticeable. Now I could see it clearly. It was tall, too tall. Its head nearly touched the low ceiling, its body unnaturally thin. The shape was human, but wrong in a way I couldn't explain. And its eyes, black, empty, staring directly at me. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. The air in the room turned ice cold, my breath coming out in visible puffs. My fingers felt numb. My mind screamed at me to run, to do something, but my body refused to listen. The whispering grew louder. It wasn't just one voice. It was many, layered, overlapping, speaking in a language I didn't understand. Then the figure shifted. Not a normal step, not a human movement. 1 second, it was in the corner. The next, it was closer. I gasped, stumbling back against the wooden door, my flashlight shaking violently in my hand. Another shift, closer. My vision blurred with panic, my pulse deafening in my ears. Then, the flashlight died. I plunged into total darkness. The whispering stopped. Silence filled the room. Then, a breath, right in front of me. The air was so cold, it burned. My skin prickled, my limbs locking up as pure terror washed over me. Then, a hand, cold, bony, pressing against my chest. I screamed. I shoved forward, my hands colliding with something solid, something ice cold. My fingers scraped over the fabric, not skin, but something like old cloth, frayed and brittle. And then it grabbed me. The hand clamped around my wrist, its grip impossibly strong. I thrashed, kicking, trying to pry myself free, but it didn't let go. A voice, low, guttural, hissed inches from my ear. It wasn't in English. I didn't understand the words, but I felt them. It was a warning. A threat. The grip tightened. I gasped in pain, my wrist burning from the sheer cold. Then, the door behind me burst open. Light flooded the room, and the grip vanished. I fell backward onto the basement floor, gasping for breath, my body trembling. I scrambled away, my eyes darting to the now open door. The room beyond it, where the figure had been, was empty. The old wooden walls, the cracked floor. No figure, no presence, just silence. I didn't wait. I didn't hesitate. I bolted. I ran up the basement stairs so fast I nearly tripped, bursting into the kitchen and slamming the basement door shut behind me. I locked it. Then I shoved the heaviest chair I could find against it, my breathing ragged. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. I turned on the flashlight, checking my wrist where the thing had grabbed me. The skin was red, bruised, ice cold to the touch. I stood there, gripping the edge of the counter, trying to steady myself. Then, from behind the basement door, a single knock. Soft, slow, like a warning. I turned and sprinted out of the house. I didn't stop running until I was outside, standing in the middle of my driveway, gasping for air. The night was cold, but nothing compared to the icy grip that had wrapped around my wrist just minutes ago. My legs felt weak, barely able to hold me up, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. The house stood behind me, dark and silent. From the outside, it looked completely normal, just an old home under the moonlight. But I knew better. I pulled out my phone, my fingers fumbling as I called the only person I could think of, my coworker, David. It rang once, twice. Then his voice came through, groggy. "Dude, it's past midnight. What's going on?" I swallowed hard and my throat dry. I hesitated, glancing back at the house. I need to get out of here. David must have heard the panic in my voice because his tone shifted immediately. "Where are you?" "At the house. I can't stay here." "All right, I'm coming," he said without hesitation. "Just stay outside. Don't go back in." I wasn't planning to. I sat on the curb, my back to the house, eyes locked on the empty street ahead. Every sound made me flinch, the rustling of leaves, the distant hum of a car engine, the wind whistling through the trees. Then, from behind me, click. My blood ran cold. The sound had come from the house. The lock on the front door. I turned slowly. The door was open. Just a crack. I hadn't touched it. I hadn't even gone near it. A shadow moved in the doorway. I shot to my feet, backing away, my breath catching in my throat. But before I could react further, headlights flooded the street. David's truck pulled up, his tires screeching as he parked. The second he saw me, he jumped out. "Dude, what the hell is going on?" I pointed at the door, but it was closed. Locked! Like it had never opened in the first place. David took one look at my face and didn't ask any more questions. "Get in the truck." I didn't argue. I climbed in, slamming the door shut behind me, my body still trembling. As we drove away, I finally let out a shaky breath, my head resting against the seat. "You want to tell me what happened?" David asked, keeping his eyes on the road. I hesitated. Where would I even begin? The strange noises? The shadow in the basement? The thing that had grabbed me? I rubbed my wrist absent-mindedly. The skin was still ice cold. "I don't know," I finally admitted. "I just know I'm never going back there." David didn't push for more details. Maybe he saw the way my hands were still shaking. Maybe he just knew, somehow, that whatever had happened back in that house wasn't something to question. That night, I crashed on his couch. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw it, the figure in the basement, the door slamming shut, the whispering in my ear. By morning, I made a decision. I was leaving. Not just the house. The entire town. I didn't even bother going back inside to pack. I told my landlord something had come up, paid whatever fees I needed to break the lease, and left. As I drove away, I kept expecting something to happen. Some final sign that whatever was in that house wasn't done with me yet. But nothing did. No shadows in the rearview mirror. No whispering voices in my ears. Just silence. I moved to a new city, got a new place, one that I made damn sure had no history attached to it. But even now, late at night, I still wake up sometimes, heart pounding, convinced I hear whispering in the dark. I tell myself it's just my imagination, but deep down, I know the truth. I left that house, but whatever was inside it, it never really left me. It's been months since I left that house, since I packed whatever little I could fit in my car and drove away without looking back. I've told myself 100 times that I made the right decision, that leaving wasn't just the smart thing to do, it was the only thing to do. But some nights, I still wonder, not about whether it was real. I know it was real. I wonder if it's over. Even now, in a new apartment, in a completely different city, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. Most days are normal. I go to work, come home, watch TV, try to move on like nothing happened. But then there are nights. Nights where I wake up at exactly 3:12 a.m., my chest tight with an unnamed fear. Nights where I swear I hear the faintest sound of whispering just beyond the walls. Nights where I feel that same cold in the air, the kind that shouldn't be there, not in a fully heated room, not under layers of blankets. And sometimes I wake up with a familiar pressure on my wrist, like fingers, like a grip. I turn on the light, check the skin, but there's nothing there. No marks, no bruises, nothing but the phantom sensation of something that shouldn't exist. And then I sit there in bed, staring at the darkness, knowing I'll never sleep again that night. I've thought about looking into the house's history, finding out if someone else went through what I did. But some part of me doesn't want to know, because if I find something, if I find proof that what I experienced was just another chapter in a long line of terror, then that means it won't stop. Not with me. Not with the next person who moves in. And if I find nothing, then that means it wasn't tied to the house. It was tied to me. That's a thought I can't handle. So I don't research. I don't ask questions. I don't look back. I just move forward, hoping, praying that whatever I left behind stays there. But in the dead of night, when the world is silent and the shadows seem a little too deep, I know better. Some things don't stay behind. This happened a few years ago. I had just finished college and landed my first decent job, working for a logistics company. It wasn't anything special, mostly paperwork and spreadsheets, but it paid well enough that I could finally move out of my cramped apartment and into a place with actual space. I found the house through a private rental listing. It wasn't anything fancy, just a modest 2-bedroom place on the outskirts of town. It had been sitting empty for a while, which meant the landlord was eager to rent it out for a reasonable price. I didn't ask why it had been vacant so long. I should have. At the time, all I cared about was how quiet it was. No noisy neighbors, no traffic sounds, no one stomping around upstairs. Just peace. The kind of silence that wraps around you like a heavy blanket. The kind of silence that later would start to feel unnatural. Moving in was easy. I didn't own much, just the essentials. A bed, a couch, a desk, and a few boxes of clothes and kitchenware. I had a few friends help me load everything into the house on a Saturday morning, and by the afternoon, we were done. The place was still a little bare, but I liked it that way. Open space. Clean. Simple. The first night was uneventful. I set up my bed, watched a few videos on my phone, and passed out early, exhausted from the move. Nothing strange happened. No eerie feelings, no weird noises. Just a normal night in a new house. Over the next few days, I settled into a routine. Work from 8 to 5, come home, make dinner, and maybe play some video games before bed. The house was always quiet, peaceful. At first, I loved it. No distractions, no disruptions. But after a while, the quiet started feeling different. Not in an obvious way, just small things. A shift in the air. A feeling like the house was waiting for something. I brushed it off. My brain was just adjusting to a new environment. Nothing to worry about. I lived alone, but I had a friend, Nate, who'd stop by every so often. He was the social one, always making plans, always dragging me out of the house to do something. On one of his visits, he walked in, looked around, and said, "Man, it's way too quiet in here." I laughed. "That's the best part." He shook his head. "I don't know. Feels weird, like the house is listening." I rolled my eyes. "You've been watching too many horror movies." He shrugged, but didn't argue. Days passed, then weeks. I got used to the silence. I even started enjoying it again. I'd come home from work, and the house would greet me with nothing but stillness. No hum of the fridge, no creaks in the walls. Just perfect, unbroken quiet. And then, one night, that changed. It was late, maybe a little past midnight. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard it. A sound. Faint. Distant. A noise where there shouldn't be one. I sat up, my heart picking up speed. Listened. Silence! Maybe I had imagined it. I laid back down, closed my eyes. Then, again. A soft, almost imperceptible sound. Like fabric shifting. Like someone moving in the next room. I held my breath. Listened harder. Nothing. The house was quiet again. After a minute, I exhaled and rolled onto my side, pulling the blanket over me. It was nothing. My mind playing tricks on me, a house settling. Something completely normal. I told myself that. Convinced myself of it. But that night, I slept with the light on. And that was just the beginning. I woke up feeling groggy the next morning. The kind of exhaustion that clings to you, even after a full night's sleep. I told myself it was just stress. A long work week catching up with me. But something about that night stuck with me. That sound. It wasn't just my imagination. I knew that now. It had been real. But I didn't want to overthink it. I had work, and the last thing I needed was to be distracted by something that was probably just the house settling. So I got up, showered, made my usual breakfast, 2 eggs, toast, and coffee, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. I checked my phone while eating. A few messages from Nate, mostly memes, and a text saying he'd swing by on the weekend. I almost told him about the sound, but I stopped myself. What was I supposed to say? "Hey, I think my house might be making noises." He'd just make fun of me. Instead, I finished my coffee, grabbed my keys, and headed to work. The day dragged. My head felt heavy, like I was still half asleep. By the time I clocked out, all I wanted to do was go home, eat something, and knock out early. I pulled into my driveway just after 6. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in deep orange and purple streaks. The house looked the same as always, quiet, still, perfectly normal. But as soon as I stepped inside, I felt it. Something was off. The air was heavier, the silence thicker. I hesitated in the doorway, listening. Nothing. I let out a breath, shaking my head. I was psyching myself out over nothing. I set my keys down on the counter and kicked off my shoes. The house was just the same as I left it. The couch, the desk, the few framed pictures I had on the walls. Everything was in place. Except for one thing. The bedroom door. I always left it open. Always. But now it was halfway shut. I frowned. Had I closed it before leaving? No, I was sure I hadn't. I walked over and pushed it open the rest of the way. My bed was untouched. The window was locked. Nothing seemed out of place. But something felt wrong. The air was different in here. Stale. Like the room hadn't been touched in weeks. I stood there for a long moment, listening to nothing. The silence pressed down on me, making my skin crawl. Then I shook my head and muttered, "I need more sleep." I walked out, leaving the door open behind me, and went to the kitchen. Dinner was simple, just some leftover pasta I heated up in the microwave. I sat at the table, eating while scrolling through my phone, doing my best to ignore the nagging feeling at the back of my mind. But as the night stretched on, that unease didn't go away. I kept glancing toward the hallway, toward my bedroom door, half expecting it to be shut again. It wasn't. It stayed open. But that didn't make me feel any better. I decided to go to bed early. Maybe a good night's sleep would clear my head. By 11, I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. My room was dark except for the soft glow of my phone screen. I put on some random YouTube video, something low volume just to have noise. The silence was too heavy. I don't know when I drifted off, but I woke up sometime later to a sound. Not loud, not sudden. Soft, faint, like fabric shifting. I tensed. It was coming from inside the house. I stayed completely still, barely breathing. The sound came again. Something moving. Something in the hallway. A slow, deliberate shuffle. I reached for my phone and turned the screen on, flooding the room with light. The sound stopped. The house was quiet again. I swallowed, my throat dry. I wanted to get up, check the hallway, but something held me in place. Fear. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, but this was different. This wasn't my imagination. This wasn't normal. I forced myself to move, throwing the blanket off and sitting up. The air felt thick, heavy. I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside my bed and stood, my heart hammering. Step by step, I made my way to the door. I peeked out into the hallway. Empty. Dark. Silent. I exhaled slowly. Then, from behind me, a creak. I spun around so fast I nearly tripped. Nothing. The room was exactly the same. The bed, the dresser, the window. But something was wrong. The closet door. It was open. Just a crack. I stared at it, my pulse pounding in my ears. Had it always been open? I was sure of it. I took a slow step forward, then another. I gripped the bat tighter and reached out with my free hand. I grabbed the edge of the door and yanked it open. Empty. Just clothes. Boxes. Nothing unusual. I let out a shaky breath. Maybe the house wasn't haunted. Maybe I was just overtired. That's what I told myself. But deep down, I knew better. And that was just the beginning. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I thought I heard something. Another creak, another soft shuffle just outside my door. I kept my phone gripped in my hand, its screen off, but ready to flood the room with light at the slightest movement. But nothing happened. Eventually, exhaustion won. I must have drifted off sometime around 4 or 5 in the morning, because the next thing I knew, my alarm was blaring and sunlight was bleeding through the blinds. I sat up, my head pounding. I didn't even bother checking my phone. I knew I had barely gotten any sleep. The air in my room felt off, stale, heavy. But I shook it off, telling myself it was just my own paranoia, making everything seem worse than it was. I forced myself through the motions of the morning. Shower, breakfast, work. But the entire day, something gnawed at me. Something in my house wasn't right, and I needed to figure out what it was. That evening, I walked into the house, bracing myself. I half expected something to be out of place. Another door left ajar. Another strange sound. But everything looked the same. At least, at first. I set my keys on the counter, kicked off my shoes, and walked into the kitchen to grab a bottle of water. As I twisted off the cap and took a sip, my eyes flicked toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. And that's when I saw it. The closet door, wide open. I froze. No, I had closed that door. I knew I had. I set the water down, my hands cold. I forced myself to walk toward the room, keeping my breathing steady. The closer I got, the more I felt it, something thick in the air, something I couldn't explain. I stood at the doorway, staring at the open closet. The inside was just as I had left it, clothes hung neatly, boxes stacked in the corner. Nothing was out of place. And yet, the door had opened. I swallowed hard. I reached out, grabbed the knob, and pulled it shut. Then I turned and walked out of the room, my heart thudding against my ribs. Something was happening here, and it wasn't just my imagination. That night, I forced myself to stay up. I needed to know. I needed proof. I sat on the couch in the living room, lights off, listening. The TV was on low, but I barely paid attention to it. My phone sat in my lap, flashlight ready. The bat was within reach. For hours, nothing happened. But then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., a knock. Soft, faint, coming from the bedroom. I sat up straight, my breath catching in my throat. Another knock, and another. Steady, unhurried. I grabbed my phone, my hand shaking slightly as I turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the hallway. I got up, moving slowly toward the sound. The knocking continued. Not frantic, not demanding, just persistent. When I reached the bedroom door, I hesitated. It was coming from the closet. I clenched my jaw, my fingers tightening around the bat. I reached out with my other hand, hard hammering, and pressed against the closet door. Silence! The knocking stopped. I held my breath, listening. Seconds passed. Then, bam! A single, loud, forceful knock from the inside. I stumbled back, my stomach twisting. That was impossible. I turned and bolted out of the room, my pulse slamming against my skull. I grabbed my keys off the counter and left. I didn't stop moving until I was in my car, doors locked, hands gripping the wheels so tightly my knuckles turned white. I sat there, staring at my house, my breaths ragged. I needed to know what was happening. I needed answers. But I wasn't going back inside. Not that night. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I sat in a diner, coffee untouched, scrolling through my phone, searching for anything that could explain what I was experiencing. Old house noises? Maybe. But this wasn't just random creaks. This was knocking, doors moving. Could someone be messing with me? That idea made my stomach turn, but it was the most rational explanation. Maybe someone had a key. Maybe someone had been in my house. I needed proof. I went to the nearest electronics store and bought a cheap security camera, one with motion detection. By noon, I was back at the house. I forced myself to walk inside, my skin crawling the moment I stepped through the door. The air was thick again. The house felt wrong, but I didn't let myself stop. I set up the camera in my bedroom, angled at the closet. If something moved that door, I would catch it. Then I left. I didn't care if it made me look paranoid. I wasn't staying in that house alone that night. I crashed at Nate's place. I didn't tell him everything, just that I was having house issues. He didn't pry. The next morning, I drove back home. I hesitated at the front door, my stomach knotting. I took a slow breath, turned the handle, and stepped inside. Everything was quiet. Everything looked normal. I walked to the bedroom, grabbed my phone, and pulled up the camera feed. I scrolled through the footage, fast-forwarding. Hours of nothing. Then, at exactly 2:13 a.m., the closet door creaked open. On its own. I felt my chest tighten. But that wasn't the worst part. A shadow moved inside the closet. Not a trick of the light. Not dust. Something inside. I froze, my fingers numb. And then, the knocking started. From inside the closet. I shut the video off and stood there, my heart hammering. Something was in my house. Something was watching me. And it wanted me to know. I couldn't stay in that house. Not after seeing that footage. Not after watching that shadow move inside my closet like it had been waiting for something. Like it had been waiting for me. I grabbed a bag, stuffed in some clothes, my phone charger, and whatever else I could think of. I wasn't even sure where I was going, but I knew I needed to get out. I took one last look around the house before I left. The air felt heavier than before, pressing down on me. It knew I had seen it. And now I was sure it was watching me. I didn't turn off the lights. I didn't check the doors. I just walked straight out and got in my car. As I pulled away from the driveway, I kept my eyes on the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something, some movement in the windows, some dark figure standing in the doorway. But there was nothing. And somehow, that made it worse. I didn't go to work the next day. I called Nate, told him I needed to stay at his place a little longer. He didn't ask questions. I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the video playing in my head over and over again. The closet door creaking open. That thing inside. The knocking. I couldn't escape it. By the second night, something shifted. It wasn't just fear anymore. It was rage. This was my house. I had lived there for years without issue. Whatever this was, it had no right to be there. And I wasn't going to let it scare me out of my own home. So, I made a plan. I was going back. And this time, I was going to confront whatever was in that house. I drove back in the late afternoon, when the sun was still up. I told myself that if I walked in while it was bright outside, I'd feel less scared. I was wrong. The moment I stepped inside, it felt like the house was waiting for me. The air was thick, pressing against my skin like something unseen was circling me. I set my bag down, walked straight to the bedroom, and pulled up the camera footage from the night before. 2:13 a.m. Again. The closet door had opened again. But this time, there was more. A shape stepped out. Not just a shadow. A figure. Tall. Stiff. Not fully human. Its body looked distorted, as if it had been stretched too long. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, and it was facing the camera. Watching. Waiting. I felt a wave of nausea rise up in my stomach. And then, the worst part. It moved, not just shifting or flickering like a shadow. It stepped closer, closer, until it was standing right in front of the camera. And then it reached out, slowly, deliberately, and shut the closet door from the outside. I dropped my phone. I couldn't breathe. That thing had been in my room, not just hiding in the closet. It had come out. It had moved. and it had closed the door, which meant it could leave. It could walk around my house. And if it could do that, it could have been anywhere. I should have left right then. But I didn't. Something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to run. I needed to know what this was. I grabbed the bat, checked my phone for the time, 10:42 p.m. If this thing was going to show up again, it would happen at 2:13 a.m. I had 4 hours to prepare. I turned every single light in the house on. I set my phone up to record in real time, live streaming the feed to my laptop. I sat in the living room, gripping the bat, staring at the hallway. And I waited. 2:10 a.m. My hands were slick with sweat. I was gripping the bat so hard my knuckles ached. I kept my eyes on my phone, the live feed still running. 2:12 a.m. Nothing. 2:13 a.m. The closet door creaked open. Slow, deliberate. My breath hitched. The air in the room grew colder. And then, a shape moved. Not on the screen. In the hallway. Outside of the bedroom. Closer to where I was sitting. I couldn't move. My grip on the bat tightened. My entire body locked in place as the figure emerged. It was just like in the video. Too tall. Too stiff. Its limbs seemed to move slower than they should, like it wasn't fully used to walking. Its head tilted toward me. And then it took a step forward. I sucked in a sharp breath. I could see it. Not just on the screen. Right in front of me. My body screamed at me to run. To move. But I didn't. I forced myself to stay still. And then it did something that made my blood freeze. It spoke. Not with words. With sound. A distorted, low crackling, like an old radio struggling to find a signal. It was trying to say something. Trying to mimic something. I gritted my teeth, lifted the bat, and forced myself to take a step forward. Its head twitched at the movement, like it hadn't expected me to fight back. Then, in a voice that didn't sound like my own, it whispered, "You shouldn't be here." My stomach dropped. My hands went numb. That was my voice. It was repeating something I had said before. It had been listening. It had been learning. And it knew me. I didn't wait for it to get closer. I turned and ran. Straight out of the house. Straight into my car. I didn't even stop to lock the door. I just drove. I didn't know where I was going. I just knew I couldn't be there anymore. I couldn't be in that house. Not with that thing. Not with something that had been watching me. Listening to me. And waiting. I didn't stop driving for a long time. The roads were mostly empty at that hour, streetlights casting long, eerie shadows as I sped past. My heart was still hammering in my chest, my hands gripping the wheels so tightly they ached. I didn't even realize where I was going until I pulled up outside Nate's place again. I turned off the engine, but I didn't get out right away. I just sat there, staring at my own reflection in the rearview mirror. I looked like a wreck, eyes wide, face pale, jaw clenched so tight it hurt. My shirt was damp with sweat, and my hands, they were still shaking. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me, something that had followed me. Nate was already asleep when I knocked on his door. He opened it after a few minutes, rubbing his eyes, looking confused. "Dude, what the hell? It's 3 in the morning." I pushed past him into the apartment without answering. I locked the door behind me. I knew how this looked. I was probably acting crazy, but I didn't care. I needed to be somewhere safe. Nate frowned. "Hey, are you okay?" I shook my head. "No." I sat down on the couch, pressing my hands together to stop them from shaking. Nate sat across from me, waiting. I didn't even know where to start. Finally, I just pulled out my phone and showed him the video. The one from earlier that night. The closet door opening. The figure stepping out, the way it moved, the way it reached for the camera. Nate didn't say a word. His face lost all color. When the clip ended, he looked at me. "That's in your house?" I nodded. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Finally, Nate exhaled. "Dude, you can't go back there." "I know." I stayed at Nate's place for a few days, trying to figure out what to do. I called my landlord, told him there was something wrong with the house. I didn't mention the thing I had seen. I knew how insane it would sound. Instead, I told him there was something wrong with the wiring, the doors, the air vents. He sent someone to check it out. They didn't find anything. Of course, they didn't. That thing wasn't some loose pipe or broken latch. It was something else. Something that didn't want to be found. I made a decision. I was done with that house. I packed up my things during the day when the sun was out. I didn't go alone. Nate came with me. I didn't tell him, but I was terrified that if I stepped inside alone, I might not come back out. It took less than an hour to gather my stuff. I didn't take much. I didn't even want to be there long enough to pack properly. By the time we loaded everything into the car, I could feel it. The air was thick again. The silence was too loud. And as I locked the front door for the last time, I swore I could hear something moving inside. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see. I just got in my car, turned the key, and left that house behind. A month passed. I found a new place, smaller, in a different part of town. It felt normal, safe, but the nightmares didn't stop. I'd wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, convinced that I had heard something. A door creaking, soft footsteps on the floor. Sometimes I'd hear my own voice, repeating something I had said before, like it was still listening, still waiting, even though I had left that house behind. I don't think it ever left me. I kept telling myself it was over. I had moved out. I had left everything behind. But deep down, I knew better. Some things don't just stop because you run away. For weeks after I left, I kept my phone on silent at night. I didn't want to hear any more notifications, didn't want to see any missed calls from an unknown number, didn't want to wake up to any more late-night static recordings. I convinced myself that it was just stress, just my mind playing tricks on me. But then, things started happening again. It wasn't like before. It wasn't loud. It was subtle, quiet. It'd wake up to my bedroom door slightly open when I knew I had closed it. A shadow in the corner of my eye, disappearing the second I turned my head. The feeling of being watched. Not all the time, but enough. Enough to make my skin crawl. Enough to keep me up at night. One night, I made a mistake. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, trying to distract myself from the unease settling in my chest. And before I could stop myself, I opened the voice memo app. I hadn't used it since that night in the house, but there was a new recording, dated 2 nights earlier. I hadn't made it. I shouldn't have played it, but I did. At first, there was nothing but static. Then, a soft creak, like a door opening. Then footsteps, slow, deliberate, getting closer. And then, a voice, right next to the microphone. Mine. "Why did you leave?" I dropped my phone. My whole body went cold. My own voice. As if I had whispered it in my sleep. Or as if something that had followed me, wanted me to know it was still there. This happened about 5 years ago, in late October. The air had that crisp bite to it, the kind that makes you pull your jacket tighter, even though you told yourself it wasn't that cold yet. At the time, I was working a stressful job, one of those desk-bound corporate nightmares that kept me buried in spreadsheets and endless emails. I hadn't taken a proper vacation in months, and when my friend, let's call him Ben, suggested a weekend getaway, I agreed without a second thought. The plan was simple: a quiet, relaxing trip away from the city, just a few hours' drive into the countryside. No distractions, no work emails, just good food, fresh air, and maybe a few drinks by the fireplace. We found Blackwood Manor in an online listing, and it looked perfect. A grand, historic hotel, nestled in the middle of nowhere, promising charm, comfort, and, most importantly, solitude. The drive up was uneventful. The road wound through dense woods, the kind where the trees seemed to lean in just a little too close, blocking out most of the daylight. The GPS signal cut out about 30 minutes before we arrived, and I had to rely on an old printed map Ben had brought along. By the time we pulled up to the hotel, the sun had started dipping behind the trees, casting long shadows across the property. Blackwood Manor was massive, the kind of building that had once been elegant, but now looked like it had been forgotten by time. Its brick facade was covered in patches of ivy, and the windows were dark, like empty eyes staring down at us. A large wooden sign by the entrance had the hotel's name carved into it, but the paint had long since faded. The driveway was empty except for a few older model cars, their presence making me wonder if we'd even have neighbors for the weekend. I glanced over at Ben. "Cozy," I muttered, trying to make light of it. He smirked. "Looks like something out of a horror movie." A part of me agreed. Inside, the atmosphere shifted. The lobby was grand, but outdated, high ceilings, a chandelier that looked like it hadn't been dusted in years, and a check-in desk made of dark oak. A fireplace crackled in the corner, giving the space an eerie orange glow. An older woman, probably in her 60s, stood behind the desk, her eyes barely lifting as we walked in. Her name tag read, Mrs. Holloway. "You boys have a reservation?" she asked, her voice flat, almost bored. Ben handled the check-in while I took in our surroundings. The place smelled faintly of old wood and something else, something musty, like the scent of a room that hadn't been aired out in years. A massive staircase wound up to the second floor, the banister polished but worn. The light fixtures flickered occasionally, and I made a mental note to check if there was a storm in the forecast. Mrs. Holloway slid over 2 keys, actual keys, not the plastic cards you'd expect from a hotel. "You're in rooms 207 and 208, she said. "Dinner's served until 9. No room service after that." Ben raised an eyebrow. "No room service at all?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and disappeared into a back room, leaving us standing there with our bags. "Friendly," I muttered. Ben chuckled. "I like it. Adds to the charm." We made our way upstairs, the wooden steps creaking under our weight. The second floor was dimly lit, with a long, narrow hallway stretching in both directions. The wallpaper was faded, peeling in some spots, and the carpet felt slightly damp underfoot. My room, 207, was on the left, right next to Ben's. The moment I stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. The room was simple: a queen bed, a small desk, an antique wardrobe, and a single window that overlooked the dense forest outside. But something felt off. I shook it off as exhaustion from the drive and set my bag down. "Meet you downstairs in 10? Ben called from his room. "Yeah," I replied, still surveying the space. I checked the bathroom, ran the sink for a second, and even opened the wardrobe, half expecting to find it full of old coats, but it was empty. Just as I was about to turn away, I noticed something scratched into the inside of the wardrobe door. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light, but the letters were unmistakable. "Leave." I stared at it for a long moment, then laughed under my breath. probably some old guest trying to be funny. Hotels like this always had their share of weird graffiti. Shaking my head, I shut the wardrobe and left the room. Dinner was held in a large dining hall with dark wooden tables and dim lighting. A few other guests sat scattered throughout the space, none of them particularly talkative. An older man near the fireplace kept his head down, barely touching his food. A woman sitting alone at the far end of the room kept glancing toward the doorway, as if expecting someone. Mrs. Holloway's demeanor hadn't changed. She moved between tables, serving plates of roast chicken and mashed potatoes, speaking only when necessary. When she reached our table, Ben, always the social one, tried to strike up a conversation. "How long has this place been open?" he asked. Mrs. Holloway set a plate down in front of him without looking up. "A long time. Business must be slow, huh?" I added, trying to lighten the mood. She finally met my gaze. "People come and go." There was something in the way she said it. Not the words themselves, but the way they sat heavy in the air. That was when I noticed something strange. The large, antique mirror on the far wall reflected the dining hall, but the woman sitting alone at the far end of the room, she wasn't in it. I blinked, looked again. She was sitting right there, shifting uncomfortably in her chair. But in the mirror, there was only an empty seat where she should have been. A cold knot formed in my stomach. I turned to Ben, nudging him. "Look at the mirror." He followed my gaze. "What about it?" I swallowed. "The woman in the corner. You see her?" Ben glanced toward her, then back at the mirror. "Yeah?" I looked again. There she was. But now she was staring directly at me. I looked back at the mirror. The seat was still empty. Ben nudged me. "Dude, you okay?" I forced a chuckle, shaking my head. "Yeah, just tired." The woman smiled at me. Not in a friendly way. Not even in a polite way. It was too wide, too knowing. I looked away and forced myself to finish my meal. But something told me, something deep inside me told me, this weekend was going to be anything but relaxing. Dinner at Blackwood Manor ended on a strange note, but I convinced myself that exhaustion was playing tricks on me. The long drive, the eerie atmosphere, and my general unease had probably made me imagine things. That had to be the explanation. Still, as we left the dining hall and made our way back upstairs, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The woman who had been sitting alone was gone. I hadn't seen her leave. The hallway on the second floor was dimly lit, the sconces along the walls casting flickering shadows. Ben was already ahead of me, his room key in hand. He wasn't bothered by any of it, the silence, the faint smell of something old and forgotten, or the way the floorboards groaned under our weight. He unlocked his door and turned back to me. "You good?" I forced a nod. "Yeah, just need some sleep. See you in the morning." I watched as he disappeared into his room, the door clicking shut behind him. I took a deep breath before unlocking my own door and stepping inside. The room was colder than before, much colder. I instinctively rubbed my arms, moving toward the thermostat. It was an old-fashioned dial, the kind you had to twist. It was already set to a reasonable temperature, but the air felt almost icy. I pulled my jacket off and tossed it onto the chair by the window. My duffel bag sat untouched at the foot of the bed. The wardrobe stood where I had left it, its doors firmly shut. Everything was normal, or at least it should have been. I went into the bathroom to wash up. The faucet creaked as I turned the handle, releasing a slow stream of cold water. I splashed some on my face, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had been sitting in my chest since dinner. When I looked up into the mirror, I froze. Behind me, the wardrobe door was wide open. I whipped around so fast I nearly slipped on the tiled floor. The door was open, fully open. Not slightly ajar, not cracked open by a draft, but completely wide, revealing the empty interior. My heartbeat hammered in my ears. I knew I had shut that door. I had checked it earlier. I took a cautious step toward it, feeling ridiculous. Maybe the latch was loose. Maybe the old wood had shifted. Maybe. Then I saw it. The word leave had changed. Before, it had been scratched faintly into the wood, almost faded. Now, the letters were deeper, more pronounced, as if someone had gone over them with something sharp. I took a step back, my breath caught in my throat. A creak sounded from the hallway outside my room. Not just any creak, a slow, deliberate footstep. I turned toward the door, my heart pounding. Another step. It wasn't Ben. His room was next to mine, but this sound was coming from farther down the hall. I moved cautiously toward the door and pressed my ear against it. Silence! Then, 3 sharp knocks. I jumped back so hard I nearly tripped over my own feet. My hands trembled as I reached for the doorknob. Ben? My voice was barely above a whisper. No response. Another knock. Louder this time. I exhaled sharply, trying to steady my nerves before yanking the door open. The hallway was empty. The lights flickered slightly, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I stepped out cautiously, glancing both ways. Nothing. No sign of anyone. Ben's door was closed. No other rooms nearby had their doors open. Then I noticed it. A wet footprint, right outside my door. It was faint but clear, a single bare footprint on the old wooden floor. A chill ran through me. My own feet were dry. I hadn't walked barefoot, and no one else was in the hall. I swallowed hard, stepping back into my room and shutting the door quickly. I locked it, flipping the latch, then double-checked to make sure it was secure. I tried to tell myself it was just the hotel's age, the creaky floors, the cold air messing with my head. But deep down, I knew something wasn't right. I didn't sleep well. Every sound made me jolt awake, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the wind rattling against the window, and once, what sounded like distant footsteps in the hallway. At some point, exhaustion won, and I must have drifted off. A loud thud woke me. I sat up fast, my breath shallow. The room was completely dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the outside lamps filtering through the curtains. Another thud. It came from the wardrobe. I held my breath, staring at it. The doors were closed again. Had I shut them? I couldn't remember. Slowly, I reached for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, casting harsh shadows across the room. Another thud. It was coming from inside the wardrobe. I forced myself to move, swinging my legs over the side of the bed. The floor was freezing beneath my feet. I stood, gripping my phone tighter, every nerve in my body screaming at me to leave it alone. But something inside me, maybe foolish curiosity, maybe something else, made me take a step closer. Another thud. I reached out, my fingers hovering just over the wooden handle. Silence! Then, a loud bang. The doors burst open. I stumbled back, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. The wardrobe was empty. But the word leave had changed again. This time, it was bigger, deeper, more violent. The letters carved so aggressively that splinters littered the bottom of the wardrobe. Something was in this room with me. I grabbed my jacket, my phone, and my room key and bolted. I didn't care what time it was. I didn't care if I woke anyone up. I needed to get out of that room. I banged on Ben's door. Ben, wake up. A moment later, the door cracked open, and Ben squinted at me, groggy. Dude, what? I shoved past him, locking his door behind me. What the hell? He muttered. I was shaking. Something's wrong with my room. He frowned, rubbing his eyes. What do you mean? I could barely get the words out. There was. Someone knocked. Footprints. Something was in the wardrobe. Ben's face shifted from confusion to concern. Are you messing with me? I shook my head. I swear, something's wrong, he sighed, running a hand through his hair. All right, show me. I didn't want to go back. Every part of me screamed against it, but I had to. We stepped into the hallway, and my door was wide open. I knew I had shut it. I had locked it. But now it stood open, the darkness inside my room feeling almost heavier. Ben stepped forward cautiously, peering inside. Dude, there's no one in here. I didn't answer. I couldn't. Because now there was something else on the inside of the wardrobe door. Not just the word leave. There was a handprint. A wet handprint. And it wasn't mine. Ben stood frozen at my doorway, his eyes locked on the wet handprint smeared across the inside of the wardrobe. The room was silent, save for the faint hum of the old radiator in the corner. Neither of us moved. Neither of us spoke. Then Ben exhaled sharply and turned to me. All right. What the hell is going on? I didn't answer immediately. I was still staring at the handprint, my pulse hammering in my ears. It wasn't possible. I had been alone in the room. The door had been locked. No one else had been inside. Ben hesitated before stepping into my room. I wanted to stop him, to tell him not to go any further, but I couldn't find my voice. He moved cautiously toward the wardrobe, then reached out and touched the handprint. He pulled his fingers back quickly. It's wet. I finally found my voice. I know. Ben turned to me, his expression shifting from skepticism to something else. Something close to concern. Dude, you're pale as hell. I swallowed hard. I'm telling you, something's wrong with this place. Ben sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, let's just think for a second. Maybe the pipes are leaking or something, and the moisture is messing with the wood. I shook my head. Then why would it be in the shape of a hand? Ben didn't have an answer for that. Instead, he looked back at the wardrobe. You said you heard knocking? Yeah, and the doors. They burst open. Ben stepped back. Okay, no, that's messed up. I let out a shaky breath. I'm not sleeping in this room. Yeah, no argument there. He looked over his shoulder toward the hallway. Let's go to the front desk. Maybe they can give you another room. I didn't need convincing. I grabbed my bag and stepped out of the room, making sure to leave the door wide open behind me. The hallway was eerily quiet. The air felt thick, heavy, like the silence had a weight of its own. The light fixtures flickered as we walked, casting strange, shifting shadows on the walls. As we reached the staircase, Ben stopped suddenly. Do you smell that? He asked. I sniffed the air. There was a faint, musty odor, something damp and decayed, like wood that had been rotting for too long. Ben frowned. It wasn't like this earlier. I shook off the chill crawling up my spine. Let's just get downstairs. We descended the creaky staircase, each step groaning under our weight. When we reached the front desk, the old man from earlier was still sitting there. He looked up at us, his eyes tired. Something wrong? Ben nudged me forward. Yeah, my friend's room is messed up. Can you switch him to another one? The old man studied me for a long moment. Then, without a word, he reached under the desk and pulled out a different key. He slid it across the counter. Third floor, he said. I hesitated. What about my old room? The man's gaze didn't waver. It'll be taken care of. That wasn't the answer I wanted. But something in his expression told me not to push. Ben grabbed the key and handed it to me. Simon, let's get out of here. As we turned to leave, the old man spoke again. If you hear knocking, don't answer. We both stopped in our tracks. I turned back to face him. What? But he was already looking down at the counter again, like he hadn't said anything at all. We took the stairs up to the third floor. The air felt heavier here, the walls lined with old paintings that seemed to watch us as we passed. My new room was at the very end of the hall. Ben unlocked the door and stepped inside first, flicking on the light. It was similar to my old room, same old-fashioned furniture, same dim lighting, but something about it felt off. Ben set my bag down. Looks normal. I wasn't so sure, but I wasn't about to go back downstairs and argue for another room. Ben stretched. All right, I'm heading back to bed. You good? I nodded. Yeah, cool. Try not to get haunted. I forced a chuckle, but as soon as he left, the unease crept back in. I double-checked the locks on the door, pulled the curtains shut, and sat on the edge of the bed. My body was exhausted, but my mind wouldn't settle. I picked up my phone, debating whether to call someone, just to hear a normal voice. But before I could, something made me stop. A noise! A dripping sound. I turned my head toward the bathroom. The sink. I walked over and twisted the faucet tightly. The dripping stopped. I exhaled, rubbing my temples. Get a grip. I turned back toward the bed. And then I saw it. The wardrobe door was open. Just a crack. My stomach twisted. I had been in this room for less than 10 minutes. I hadn't touched the wardrobe. I took a cautious step forward and reached for the handle. My fingers hesitated over the cold wood. Then, from inside the wardrobe, something shifted. A whisper of movement. I yanked the door open. Nothing. Just empty space, the faint smell of dust and aged wood. I exhaled, feeling ridiculous. My nerves were getting the best of me. I reached for the door to shut it again, and then I noticed the inside. Scratched into the back panel, barely visible in the dim light, was a single word. Stay! I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. My heart pounded so loudly I could hear it in my ears. Then, the lights flickered, and the dripping sound started again. But this time, it wasn't coming from the sink. It was coming from the wardrobe. I ran. I didn't grab my bag. I didn't look back. I just tore out of the room and into the hallway. I was halfway to Ben's room when I heard it, footsteps behind me. Slow, heavy, following. I didn't stop. I pounded on Ben's door. Ben, open up. A moment later, the door swung open. Dude, what? I shoved past him, slamming the door shut behind me. Ben stared at me. Are you serious? I couldn't even speak. My body was shaking, my breath ragged. Ben grabbed my shoulders. What happened? I forced the words out. The wardrobe. There was something. Ben's face went pale. In your room? I nodded. Ben exhaled. Okay, we're leaving. I didn't argue. I just nodded. Then, a knock at the door. 3 sharp knocks. Ben and I both froze. Another knock. Slow, deliberate. Then, from the other side of the door, a voice. A whisper. Stay! The knock came again, 3 slow, deliberate raps against the wooden door. Ben and I stood frozen, our breath caught in our throats. The air in the room felt suffocating, thick with something unseen but undeniably there. The voice came next. Stay! A whisper, distant but close, as if it wasn't coming from outside the door, but rather from inside the walls themselves. I felt my stomach twist, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Ben's hand tightened around my arm, his grip trembling. Who the hell is that? He whispered. I shook my head. I didn't have an answer. The knock came again. This time, it sounded different, not knuckles against wood, but something dull and wet. Ben backed away, shaking his head. Nope, we are not doing this. He grabbed his bag from the floor and slung it over his shoulder. We're leaving. Right now. I wanted to argue that we should call someone, alert the front desk, do something other than just run. But my instincts screamed at me to move. Then, the doorknob turned. Slowly, methodically. The old metal lock rattled. Ben and I stumbled back, hitting the wall behind us. My chest tightened as I watched the knob twist. the mechanism clicking as it struggled against the deadbolt. Ben grabbed my wrist and yanked me toward the window. "Screw the door." "Well, go out this way." He fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking as he tried to slide it open. Behind us, the door groaned. The air in the room changed. A pressure built in my ears, like the feeling you get when you're deep underground. Then, something scratched against the door. A slow, deliberate dragging. Fingernails? No, something sharper. Ben cursed under his breath, still struggling with the window. The scratching stopped. For a heartbeat, the room was silent. Then, something pushed against the door from the outside. A slow, heavy weight leaning into it. The wood creaked. The entire doorframe shuddered. I took a step toward Ben, desperate to get that damn window open, when, bang! The door buckled inward. Ben yanked the window open just as a long, blackened hand slipped through the widening gap in the door. Not human. Not alive. The skin was bloated and damp, the fingers unnaturally long. The nails, if they could even be called that, were jagged, yellowed, curving slightly at the ends like broken claws. My stomach lurched. The hand twitched. Then it reached for us. I shoved Ben toward the window. "Go, go." He didn't hesitate. He threw one leg over the ledge, hoisted himself up, and disappeared onto the fire escape. I turned back toward the door, just in time to see the fingers press against the floor. They left behind a dark, wet imprint. The stench hit me next. Rot, decay, stagnant water. I gagged, my head spinning, but I didn't have time to be sick. I scrambled onto the fire escape, practically throwing myself outside. Ben was already climbing down. I followed, moving as fast as my shaking limbs would allow. Above us, the hotel window remained open. But the room was dark now. The lights had gone out. For a second I thought maybe whatever had been in there was gone. But then, from the darkness, something shifted. A figure, standing just beyond the window, barely visible in the shadows. It didn't move, it didn't breathe, it just watched. Then, the whisper came again. "Stay!" A violent gust of wind slammed the window shut. Ben and I practically fell down the last few rungs of the fire escape. Our feet hit the pavement and we ran. We didn't stop. Not when we heard something slam against the hotel's outer wall. Not when the air grew thick with that rotten stench. Not even when we reached my car, threw ourselves inside, and peeled out of the lot. We just kept going. It wasn't until we were miles away, parked at a gas station under the harsh glow of fluorescent lights, that we finally caught our breath. I just sat there, gripping the steering wheel, trying to shake the feeling that we hadn't actually escaped. That whatever was in that hotel was still watching. Somewhere. We sat in that gas station parking lot for what felt like forever. The cold air from the cars did nothing to calm the sweat clinging to my skin. My heart was still hammering, my hands still shaking against the steering wheel. Ben hadn't spoken in a while. He just sat there, staring out the windshield, his chest rising and falling like he was trying to steady himself. I wanted to tell him that it was over, that we'd left that thing behind, that the hotel was miles away now, nothing more than a bad memory. But I couldn't bring myself to say it, because it didn't feel over. I could still smell it, that thick, rotting, waterlogged stench. And every time I blinked, I saw that hand. Bloated, blackened, reaching. Ben finally broke the silence. "Did you see it?" His voice was barely above a whisper. I swallowed hard. "See what?" He turned to face me. "The thing in the window." My stomach tightened. I didn't want to say yes. I didn't want to admit that I had seen it, that it had seen me. But I couldn't lie. "Yeah." Ben ran a hand over his face and exhaled sharply. "We need to tell someone." I hesitated. Tell them what? That the place is haunted? That we were almost... He cut himself off, shaking his head. Dude, we can't just leave this alone. I gripped the steering wheel tighter. And who the hell do we even call? We both knew the answer. No one would believe us. The hotel had been there for decades, and if anyone else had experienced what we did, they sure as hell hadn't done anything about it. Ben leaned forward, pressing his hands against his face. We should go back, he muttered. I snapped my head toward him. Are you out of your damn mind? We need proof. No, I said firmly. We need to leave this alone. But even as I said it, I could feel that same weight pressing down on me, that unnerving sense that we weren't actually done with it. Ben let out a dry, humorless laugh. Yeah, okay. Let's just pretend none of this happened. I didn't respond. Because what else could we do? We sat there in silence for a while longer, neither of us knowing what to say. The gas station lights flickered above us. The night was still. Too still. Then, something tapped against the back window. 3 times. Ben's breath hitched. I felt a sharp chill race down my spine. No! Slowly, I turned to look. Nothing. Just the empty parking lot. But I felt it. Something was still there. Watching. Waiting. I shoved the key into the ignition and started the car, my hands trembling. We're leaving. Ben didn't argue. We pulled out of the parking lot and onto the road. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something standing under the gas station lights, staring after us. But there was nothing. We drove in silence. Every mile we put between ourselves and that hotel felt like peeling away a layer of suffocation. But that weight, that feeling, never completely left. By the time we reached Ben's apartment, we were both exhausted. Neither of us said much as he got out of the car. He just nodded at me before heading inside, like he knew we couldn't talk about it yet. I drove home. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The knock, the whisper, the scraping against the door. And just as I started to drift off, right on the edge of sleep, I smelled it. That rotting, damp stench. My eyes snapped open. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't in that hotel anymore. I was in my own room, in my own bed. But for the briefest second, I swore something was standing in the corner, watching, waiting. The days that followed were quiet, too quiet. Ben and I barely spoke about what had happened. It was like some unspoken agreement had settled between us. If we didn't acknowledge it, maybe it would go away. But it didn't. It followed us. Not in the obvious, dramatic way you'd expect from some horror movie. No flickering lights. No shadowy figures looming at the foot of the bed. No, it was much worse. It was subtle, insidious. It was in the way the air in my apartment felt heavier at night. The way my cat, who had never been skittish before, suddenly refused to enter my bedroom. The way I kept waking up at 3:17 a.m. Every single night, my throat dry, my body frozen in place, my mind screaming at me not to look toward the darkened corner of my room. It was the way I started smelling that damp, rotting stench in random places, my car, my bathroom, even at work. At first, I tried to rationalize it. Maybe my mind was just playing tricks on me. Maybe the stress of that night had planted something in my subconscious, and my brain refused to let it go. But then Ben called me. It was late. Probably around midnight. When I answered, I could hear his breathing, shallow and uneven. You smell it too, don't you? He asked, his voice hoarse. My grip tightened around my phone. I didn't have to ask what he meant. Yeah. There was a long silence. Then, almost too softly to hear, I think it followed us. I closed my eyes. My pulse pounded in my ears. We need to do something, I said. But what? Burn the hotel down? Find some priest? Apologize for stepping into a place we never should have been in the first place? Ben exhaled shakily. I've been looking stuff up, he admitted. "Stories about that hotel. That got my attention." I sat up straighter. "And?" He hesitated. "There's barely anything. A few old forum posts from people who stayed there and got weird vibes, but nothing solid. No big history. No tragic murders or crazy backstory." That made it worse. If there had been some logical explanation, some tragic event that we could tie it to, maybe we could have understood it. Maybe we could have made sense of it. But this was something older, something deeper, something that didn't need a reason to exist. We didn't sleep much after that. Days turned into weeks. The feeling never left. One night, Ben told me he was leaving town for a while. Needed to clear his head. I didn't blame him. I thought about doing the same. Packing up, moving somewhere else, putting as much distance between myself and that hotel as possible. But I knew it wouldn't help, because it wasn't the hotel that was the problem anymore. It was us. We had seen it, and now it had seen us. I don't know if it's still watching. I don't know if it's waiting for something. But I do know one thing. Every night at exactly 3:17 a.m., I wake up, and I don't dare look at the corner of my room.